Hello everyone. I know you used this video to fall asleep, but before you do, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now just get cozy and enjoy. It started as an ordinary day at my workshop. You see, I've been fixing watches and clocks for over 30 years now. My little shop, nestled in the corner of an old alley, has seen countless timepieces pass through its doors, but none of them were like the one I'm about to tell you about. It was late afternoon when the man walked in. He was tall, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 stories. He placed an old, ornate clock on the counter. It was beautiful, crafted from dark wood, with delicate carvings of leaves and flowers. But the hands were moving backward. "I tried everything," the man said, his voice trembling slightly. "Every time I reset it, every time I adjust the gears, it just starts ticking backward again." I nodded, giving the clock a closer look. There was something strange about it, something that made my skin prickle. But I shrugged it off. A clock that ticked backward was just a mechanical issue, I told myself. Nothing more. "Leave it with me," I said, smiling reassuringly. "I'll have it working in no time." The man hesitated, his fingers lingering on the clock for a moment, as if he didn't want to let go. Then he nodded and walked out of the shop, glancing back over his shoulder one last time. I got to work immediately. I disassembled the clock with practiced ease, laying out the gears and springs on my workbench. Everything seemed normal at first. The gears were a little worn, but that was expected for a clock of its age. I cleaned each part carefully, then put it all back together. I set the time and watched as the second hand moved. For a moment, everything seemed fine. The hand moved forward, ticking rhythmically as it should. I turned away to put away my tools, feeling a sense of satisfaction. But when I looked back, the hand was moving backward again, slowly but surely reversing the time. I frowned, leaning closer. It didn't make sense. I'd fixed hundreds of clocks like this before. None of them had ever defied me like this one was doing. I adjusted the gears again, even replaced a few just to be sure. But no matter what I did, the clock kept ticking backward. Frustrated, I decided to leave it for the night. Sometimes a break is all you need to see things clearly. I locked up the shop and headed home, but I couldn't get the clock out of my mind. It was as if it was mocking me, challenging me to make it right. The next day, I arrived at the shop early, determined to fix the damn thing. I tried everything I could think of, but nothing worked. Hours passed, and the clock continued to tick backward, as stubborn as ever. It was around noon when I noticed something else. The time it was showing wasn't random. It was following a pattern, counting back 1 minute at a time, reversing the hours, the days. It was as if it was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand what. Then the phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. I was so engrossed in the clock, in trying to solve its mystery, that I barely heard it at first. But finally, I picked up the receiver. "Hello." There was silence on the other end, just a faint crackling sound like an old radio struggling to pick up a signal. I was about to hang up when I heard it, a voice, distant and echoing, as if it was coming from far away. "Don't fix it." I shivered, glancing around the empty shop. "Who is this?" "Don't fix it," the voice repeated, a little clearer now, but still strange, as if it was being transmitted through layers of time and space. Then the line went dead. I hung up the phone, my heart racing. I looked back at the clock, its hands steadily moving backward, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of fear. What was this thing? Days turned into weeks, and the clock remained in my shop. The man never came back for it, and I never tried to contact him. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like it was my responsibility now. I had to figure out what was going on, had to fix it, no matter what. I started noticing other things too. Little things at first. The shop felt colder, even though the weather outside was warm. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. And then there were the dreams. Every night, I'd dream of the clock. I'd see it ticking backward, the hands spinning faster and faster, and then I'd be somewhere else. A dark place, full of shadows and whispers. I'd hear voices calling my name, see faces I didn't recognize. It felt like I was being pulled back in time, dragged through memories that weren't mine. I woke up every morning drenched in sweat, the fear from the dreams clinging to me like a second skin. But I couldn't stay away from the clock, It was like a compulsion, a need that I couldn't ignore. One night, after another restless sleep, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to destroy it. If I couldn't fix it, then maybe I could at least get rid of it, and whatever curse it had brought into my life. I grabbed a hammer from the workbench and raised it high, ready to smash the clock into pieces. But just as I was about to bring it down, the phone rang again. "Don't do it." The voice was clearer now, stronger. It sounded almost like me. I dropped the hammer, my hand shaking. "Who are you?" There was a pause, then a soft chuckle, one that sent chills down my spine. "You know who I am." I didn't want to know. But deep down, I felt like I already did. "Why shouldn't I destroy it?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Because it's your only chance." The line went dead again, leaving me standing there, holding the phone with trembling hands. My only chance? Chance at what? I didn't understand, but I put the hammer down. I couldn't bring myself to destroy the clock. Not yet. Days turned into nights, and I continued to work on the clock, trying everything I could think of. But it was no use. The hands kept ticking backward, taking me with them, further and further into the past. I started losing track of time. Sometimes I'd wake up in the shop, not remembering how I got there. Other times, I'd find myself standing in front of the clock, watching it tick backward, hours slipping away like sand through my fingers. And then, one day, I noticed something strange. The time on the clock had reached a date I recognized, my birthday years ago. I watched, mesmerized, as the hands continued to move, counting down the hours, the minutes, until it stopped. The clock had rewound itself to the moment I was born. I didn't know what it meant, didn't know what to do. I was afraid, more afraid than I'd ever been in my life, but I couldn't look away. The hands started moving forward again, slowly at first, then faster. Time was reversing itself, bringing me back to the present, to the here and now. And then it kept going. It ticked past the present, into the future, faster and faster, until the numbers on the clock were a blur. I felt like I was being torn apart, like my whole life was being unraveled, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. And then everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the shop. The clock was gone. The workbench was empty, as if it had never been there at all. I staggered to my feet, my head spinning. I felt different, like something inside me had changed, shifted. I looked around the shop, but everything was as it should be. The sun was shining through the windows, dust motes dancing in the light. It was just another ordinary day. But I knew it wasn't. Something had happened. Something I couldn't remember, but that had left its mark on me, deep and indelible. I left the shop that day, locking the door behind me. I haven't gone back since. I can't. Every time I even think about it, I feel that same cold fear, that sense of something dark and terrible lurking just beneath the surface. I don't know where the clock is now, or what happened to the man who brought it to me. Maybe it's better that way. Maybe some things are meant to remain a mystery. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it. The faint, steady ticking of a clock, counting down the minutes, the hours, ticking backward through time. And I wonder, what would have happened if I'd destroyed it? What would have happened if I'd left it alone? Maybe I'll never know. But I can't shake the feeling that the clock is still out there, somewhere, ticking away the seconds, waiting for the right time to reveal its secrets. Waiting for someone else to find it. And when they do, I hope they're stronger than I was. Because once you hear that ticking, once you feel time slipping away from you, there's no going back. Only forward. I've always loved speed. It's the thrill of the chase, the roar of the engine, and the blur of the world as I push my car to its limits. There's nothing quite like it. Racing is in my blood, and I've been on every track in the state, but there's one place that always gives me chills, Crawford Speedway. It's not just another track. There's something off about it. The kind of off that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I can't quite put my finger on it, but every time I race there, weird stuff happens. It started small, mechanical issues, strange noises, but then I noticed something even stranger, the fuel gauge. No matter how much gas I put in before the race, as soon as I hit that first lap, the needle would drop straight to empty. But here's the thing, it never ran out. I pushed the car to the limit, expecting it to sputter and die, but it just kept going. It didn't matter how hard I drove or how many laps I did. The engine never stopped. It was like the car was feeding on something else. Something unnatural. I remember the first time I noticed it. I was tearing down the back straight, the crowd just a blur of faces, when I glanced at the dashboard. The needle was buried in the red. I felt my heart skip a beat. I knew I'd topped off the tank before the race. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe the gauge was busted, or there was a leak. But then I made it through the next lap. And the one after that. I finished the race, came in third, and rolled into the pits expecting to see a bone-dry tank. But when I popped the cap, gas gushed out, spilling over the sides. My crew chief, Rick, looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Didn't you check the gauge?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah," I muttered, staring at the ground. It showed empty. He gave me a skeptical look but didn't press further. I couldn't blame him. It sounded crazy even to me. But it happened again. And again. Every damn time I raced at Crawford. I started dreading the place, but I couldn't stay away. There was something about it that pulled me back. Maybe it was the challenge, or maybe it was just plain curiosity. Whatever it was, I kept going back. And every time the needle would drop and the car would keep going. One night, I decided to stick around after the race, just to see if there was anything I was missing. The other drivers had packed up and left, and the track was empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the floodlights. I was alone, or so I thought. I was leaning against the hood of my car, staring out at the empty track, when I heard it, a soft whispering sound, like voices carried on the wind. I turned, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. I couldn't make out any words, just the sound of voices overlapping, a chaotic chorus of despair. My heart was pounding in my chest as I backed away, but the whispers followed me. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the track. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. I tried to get up, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed with fear, as the figure glided towards me. The whispers were deafening now, filling my head with a torrent of words I couldn't understand. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure stopped inches away from me, its hollow eyes staring down. Then it spoke, its voice a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You race on the blood of the damned." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My mind raced, trying to make sense of its words. "The blood of the damned?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a bony hand and pointed to my car. I turned, following its gaze, and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, etched into the dirt around my tires, was a ring of dark, sticky blood. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, as if considering my question. Then it spoke again, its voice echoing in my mind. "The track is cursed. Every lap you take, you feed it. Every race you win, you seal your fate." I stared at it, my mind spinning. "Feed it? What the hell are you talking about?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned and began to fade, dissolving into the darkness. The whispers died down, leaving me alone in the silence of the empty track. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was right. That every time I raced at Crawford, I was feeding something dark, something evil. I've always loved speed. It's the thrill of the chase, the roar of the engine, and the blur of the world as I push my car to its limits. There's nothing quite like it. Racing is in my blood, and I've been on every track in the state, but there's one place that always gives me chills, Crawford Speedway. It's not just another track. There's something off about it. The kind of off that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I can't quite put my finger on it, but every time I race there, weird stuff happens. It started small mechanical issues, strange noises. But then I noticed something even stranger, the fuel gauge. No matter how much gas I put in before the race, as soon as I hit that first lap, the needle would drop straight to empty. But here's the thing, it never ran out. I pushed the car to the limit, expecting it to sputter and die, but it just kept going. It didn't matter how hard I drove or how many laps I did. The engine never stopped. It was like the car was feeding on something else. Something unnatural. I remember the first time I noticed it. I was tearing down the back straight, the crowd just a blur of faces, when I glanced at the dashboard. The needle was buried in the red. I felt my heart skip a beat. I knew I'd topped off the tank before the race. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe the gauge was busted, or there was a leak. But then I made it through the next lap, and the one after that. I finished the race, came in third, and rolled into the pits expecting to see a bone-dry tank. But when I popped the cap, gas gushed out, spilling over the sides. My crew chief, Rick, looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Didn't you check the gauge?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah," I muttered, staring at the ground. It showed empty. He gave me a skeptical look but didn't press further. I couldn't blame him. It sounded crazy even to me. But it happened again, and again, every damn time I raced at Crawford. I started dreading the place, but I couldn't stay away. There was something about it that pulled me back. Maybe it was the challenge, or maybe it was just plain curiosity. Whatever it was, I kept going back. And every time, the needle would drop and the car would keep going. One night, I decided to stick around after the race, just to see if there was anything I was missing. The other drivers had packed up and left, and the track was empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the floodlights. I was alone, or so I thought. I was leaning against the hood of my car, staring out at the empty track, when I heard it, a soft whispering sound, like voices carried on the wind. I turned, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. I couldn't make out any words, just the sound of voices overlapping, a chaotic chorus of despair. My heart was pounding in my chest as I backed away, but the whispers followed me. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the track. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. I tried to get up, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed with fear as the figure glided towards me. The whispers were deafening now, filling my head with a torrent of words I couldn't understand. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure stopped inches away from me, its hollow eyes staring down. Then it spoke, its voice a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You race on the blood of the damned." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My mind raced, trying to make sense of its words. "The blood of the damned." I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a bony hand and pointed to my car. I turned, following its gaze, and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, etched into the dirt around my tires, was a ring of dark, sticky blood. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, as if considering my question. Then it spoke again, its voice echoing in my mind. "The track is cursed. Every lap you take, you feed it. Every race you win, you seal your fate." I stared at it, my mind spinning. Feed it? What the hell are you talking about? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned and began to fade, dissolving into the darkness. The whispers died down, leaving me alone in the silence of the empty track. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was right. That every time I raced at Crawford, I was feeding something dark, something evil. I didn't go back to the track for weeks after that. I tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't. The whispers haunted me, echoing in my head every time I closed my eyes. I knew I had to go back. I had to find out the truth. When I finally did, it was a rainy night, the kind that sends shivers down your spine. The track was empty, shrouded in a thick fog that clung to the ground like a ghost. I parked my car in the pits and made my way to the starting line. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the empty track. The whispers were faint, almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the asphalt. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty stands. The air grew cold, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned, And there it was, the figure, standing at the edge of the track, its hollow eyes staring into mine. "You have raced on this cursed ground," it whispered, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You have fed it, and now it wants more." "More?" I echoed, my heart pounding in my chest. "What does it want?" The figure raised a bony hand and pointed to my car. "It wants your soul." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "My soul?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure nodded slowly, its hollow eyes boring into mine. "Every race, you give a piece of yourself. Every lap, you lose a part of your soul. And now it wants the rest." I stumbled back, my mind spinning. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "That's not possible." The figure took a step closer, its bony hand reaching out towards me. "You cannot escape your fate," it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring as I tore out of the pits and onto the track. The rain was pouring down now, the fog thickening around me as I sped down the straightaway. The whispers were deafening, filling my head with a torrent of voices. I pushed the car harder, the speedometer climbing as I raced through the darkness. But no matter how fast I went, I couldn't escape them. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the track, its hollow eyes watching me as I flew past. I glanced at the fuel gauge, and my heart skipped a beat. The needle was buried in the red, but the car kept going, the engine roaring as I pushed it to its limits. I didn't know what I was doing or where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away. I had to escape the whispers, the figure, the cursed track. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped. That I was racing in circles, feeding the darkness with every lap I took. I don't know how long I drove or how many laps I did. Time seemed to blur, the rain pounding against the windshield as I sped through the fog. The whispers grew louder, a chaotic chorus of despair that echoed in my head. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The rain, the whispers, the fog, all of it vanished, leaving me alone in the silence of the empty track. I slowed the car to a stop, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced at the fuel gauge, and my blood ran cold. The needle was back in the red, but the car had stopped. I stumbled out of the car, my legs shaking as I made my way to the edge of the track. The figure was gone, the darkness swallowed by the faint light of dawn breaking over the horizon. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I was dreaming or if it was real. All I know is that I can't go back to Crawford. Not ever. Because every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers. I see the hollow eyes of the figure staring into my soul. And I know, deep down, that it's still there waiting for me. And if I go back, it will take what it wants. The rest of my soul. The last lap. The end of the race. I've always been a simple man, living a quiet life in the small town of Waverley. Baking has been my craft, my passion, for as long as I can remember. My grandfather taught me everything I know, and I took over his bakery after he passed away. Sullivan's Bakery had been a staple in the community for generations. People came in for the soft rolls, sweet pastries, and of course the bread. It was nothing fancy, but it was home. I opened the bakery every morning at 5, the smell of yeast and fresh dough filling the air as I prepared the day's batch. Everything was routine, down to the last detail. That's why I noticed immediately when something was off about one of the loaves. It was a Thursday morning when I pulled the strange loaf out of the oven. It looked normal at first, golden and crispy, just the way it should be. But as I turned it over, I saw the pattern on the crust. A series of swirling, interlocking shapes, almost like runes or symbols. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The shapes seemed to shift slightly, as if they were alive, wriggling under the golden surface. I chuckled, figuring I was just tired. Maybe a piece of dough had fallen on top while baking, creating a weird pattern. I brushed it off and put it on the cooling rack. But something about it nagged at me. It felt wrong. The day went on as usual. Mrs. Henderson came in for her daily baguette, Mr. Reeves bought his favorite sourdough, and the kids from the high school dropped by after classes for some cookies. No one noticed the strange loaf sitting quietly on the rack behind the counter. It wasn't until late in the afternoon, when I was closing up, that I thought about it again. I decided to take the loaf home. Maybe I'd eat it myself or use it for croutons. I wrapped it in a paper bag and left the bakery, locking up behind me. The walk home was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, but the streets were empty. Once I got home, I unwrapped the loaf and set it on the kitchen counter. The symbols were still there, clearer now in the bright kitchen light. I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of them. They almost looked like writing, but in no language I'd ever seen. "Get a grip, Sullivan," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. "It's just bread. Bread doesn't have writing on it." I sliced off a piece and took a bite. It tasted fine, a bit sweeter than usual, but nothing extraordinary. That night, I had the strangest dream. I was back in the bakery, standing in front of the oven. The door was open, and inside, instead of bread, there were more of those symbols, glowing and pulsing like they were alive. They swirled around me, whispering in a language I didn't understand. I woke up in a cold sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs. The next morning, I felt a bit silly about the whole thing. It was just a dream, probably brought on by too much stress. I decided to throw the rest of the loaf away and forget about it. But when I went downstairs, it was gone. I stood there in my kitchen, staring at the empty spot on the counter where I'd left it. I lived alone, so there was no one else who could have taken it. I checked the trash, the fridge, even the pantry, but it was nowhere to be found. A shiver ran down my spine, and I shook my head. I was losing it, that's all. Stress, lack of sleep. I pushed it out of my mind and headed back to the bakery. For a few days, things were normal. The routine of kneading dough, greeting customers, and watching the sun rise over the town soothed my nerves. I almost forgot about the strange loaf. Almost. It was the following week, on another Thursday morning, when it happened again. I pulled a fresh batch of bread from the oven, and there it was. Another loaf with those same strange patterns. My heart sank as I stared at it, my hands trembling. This time, the symbols were different, but they had the same writhing quality, like they were alive. I didn't touch it. I just left it on the rack and went about my day, trying to ignore it. But the customers noticed. People started whispering, pointing. One woman, a tourist, even asked to take a picture. I laughed it off, making some joke about experimental baking, but I could feel the unease building in my chest. When I was alone again, I wrapped the loaf in a cloth and shoved it into a cupboard in the back. I didn't want to take it home this time. I didn't want it anywhere near me. But as I turned to leave, I swear I heard something. A faint whisper, like someone saying my name, "Sullivan." I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the loaf, sitting silently in the cupboard. I slammed the door shut and stumbled out of the bakery, locking up as quickly as I could. That night, the dream came back. This time, I wasn't in the bakery. I was in a dark, endless space, surrounded by those glowing symbols. They spun around me, faster and faster, whispering in that strange language. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then they stopped, and everything went black. I woke up gasping for air. My throat raw like I'd been screaming for hours. My whole body was shaking, and I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like something heavy was sitting on me. I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. I had to find out what was happening. The next day, I didn't open the bakery. I spent hours on the internet, searching for anything that could explain the symbols. I looked up runes, ancient languages, even weird cult symbols, but nothing matched. The more I searched, the more desperate I became. I was going down a rabbit hole, and I didn't like where it was leading. I went back to the bakery that evening. The street was quiet, and the sky was darkening with the approach of a storm. I let myself in and went straight to the cupboard. The loaf was still there, but it looked different. The crust was cracked, and a faint, sickly sweet smell wafted from it. I took it out, my hands trembling, and set it on the counter. As I stared at it, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The symbols were forming words in English. "Help me." My heart pounded in my chest. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging the surface of the bread. The words seemed to shift and change, and new ones appeared. "He's coming." I stumbled back, my head spinning. Who was coming? What was this thing? Panic clawed at my throat as I grabbed the loaf and ran outside. I didn't know what I was going to do. but I had to get rid of it. I drove out of town, the loaf on the passenger seat next to me. The storm had arrived, and rain pounded against the windshield. I drove to the old quarry, where the kids used to hang out before it was fenced off. I climbed out of the car, clutching the loaf in my hands, and stumbled to the edge of the pit. The rain soaked through my clothes, and the wind howled around me as I threw the loaf into the darkness. I watched it disappear into the black water below, my heart still racing. It was over. It had to be. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, before turning back to the car. But as I did, I saw something that made my blood freeze. In the muddy ground next to the car, there were footprints. Fresh, human footprints. And they were leading away from the quarry. I looked around frantically, but there was no one there. Just the howling wind and the pouring rain. I jumped into the car and sped back to town, my mind racing. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about those footprints, about the words on the loaf. I felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. The next morning, I went back to the bakery. I didn't know what I was expecting, but everything seemed normal. I opened up and started preparing for the day. But when I went to pull the first batch of bread out of the oven, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. There it was. Another loaf with those same symbols. This time, they were clearer, more defined. And in the center of the crust, there was a single word. Run. I dropped the loaf, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. I grabbed my coat and ran out of the bakery, not even bothering to lock up. I just kept running, the word flashing in my mind. Run, run, run. I didn't stop until I reached the old church on the edge of town. I burst through the doors, panting and shaking. Father Thomas was there, lighting candles. He looked up, startled. Sullivan? What's wrong? I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. I felt like I was losing my mind. The room spun, and I collapsed on the floor, the darkness closing in around me. When I woke up, I was lying on a cot in the back of the church. Father Thomas was sitting next to me, his face creased with worry. It lunged at us, and I felt a searing pain in my chest. I screamed, clutching at my shirt, and fell to the floor. Father Thomas shouted something, and the thing recoiled, the holy water sizzling as it hit the smoke. The thing shrieked and writhed, and then, with a final ear-splitting scream, it disappeared. The room was silent, the only sound our ragged breathing. I lay on the floor, gasping for air, my whole body trembling. Father Thomas knelt beside me, his face pale. It's gone, he whispered. For now. We left the house that night. I couldn't stay there, not after what had happened. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend on the other side of town. Father Thomas promised to keep an eye on the bakery, to make sure nothing else happened. But I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel it, lurking at the edges of my mind, waiting. The dreams didn't stop. They got worse. I saw things, dark and twisted things, and always there were those symbols whispering my name. I don't know how much longer I can take it. I'm afraid to sleep, afraid to close my eyes. I can feel it watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I don't know what it wants, but I know it's not done with me. I thought about leaving, about running as far away as I can. But deep down, I know it won't matter. Whatever this thing is, it's not bound by distance. It's inside me now, a part of me. And no matter where I go, it will follow. I don't know how this will end, but I have a feeling it won't be good. I just hope, when it's over, that there's something left of me. Something that won't be swallowed by the darkness. Because I can feel it growing stronger every day. And I don't know how much longer I can fight it. I just hope I have the strength to resist. Because if I don't, I know what will happen. I'll become like that loaf, a vessel for something dark and twisted. And I don't know if I'll be able to stop myself from spreading it, from letting it loose on the world. So if you're reading this, please be careful. Don't let it in. Don't let it take you. Because once it does, there's no escape. Not for you. Not for any of us. I've been running my brewery for almost 10 years now, and I thought I'd seen it all. I've had bottles explode, yeast go rogue, and hops that smelled like something died in the fermenter. But nothing could have prepared me for the batch I now call Batch 13. It started like any other brew day. The sun was barely up when I arrived at the brewery, the air still crisp and the town waking up slowly. My brewery, Midnight Brews, was a small operation, but it had a loyal following. People liked the personal touch, the fact that I was always around to chat about my latest concoction or what hops I was experimenting with. Batch 13 was supposed to be a special release, a dark ale infused with locally sourced honey and spices. I've been excited about it for weeks. The brewdag went off without a hitch. The mash smelled heavenly, and the wort had the perfect color. I pitched the yeast, sealed up the fermenter, and marked the calendar for 2 weeks later, standard time for fermentation. I didn't think much of it at first. Fermentation sometimes takes a little longer, especially with higher gravity beers. But 3 weeks passed, then 4, and the gravity readings barely moved. It was as if the yeast was taking a nap. I was puzzled but not worried. I'd just give it more time. Around the 6th week, though, I knew something was wrong. The beer looked normal enough, but the fermenter was cold to the touch, almost icy, despite the warm summer weather. When I opened the spigot to take a sample, a strange, pungent aroma hit me, like something sour and metallic mixed with the usual malty sweetness. The taste was even stranger, a bitter, almost medicinal aftertaste that lingered on my tongue long after I'd swallowed. I tried not to think about it too much. Maybe I'd misjudged the yeast, or perhaps there was a contamination I hadn't detected. I thought about dumping the whole batch right then, but something stopped me. There was a voice in the back of my head, almost like a whisper, urging me to wait. So I did. I waited and watched as the airlock bubbled slowly, the yeast sluggishly doing its work. By the 8th week, I started having nightmares. In the dreams, I was standing in the brewery, surrounded by barrels and bottles, but everything was wrong. The walls seemed to bend and twist, the shadows stretching out like they were alive. The fermenter with batch 13 loomed in the center, massive and menacing. And there was something inside it, scratching and clawing at the metal, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and the taste of that strange, bitter beer on my tongue. I told myself it was just stress. Running a business alone wasn't easy, and I was probably just overworked. But the nightmares didn't stop, and the beer, oh, that damned beer, kept fermenting. It was during one of those restless nights that I decided to head down to the brewery to put an end to this madness once and for all. The streets were empty, the town asleep. I unlocked the brewery doors, the familiar smell of malt and hops greeting me, but there was an undertone now, a faint scent of decay that made my stomach turn. The fermenter sat in the middle of the room, as it always did, but tonight it seemed to pulse, the metal vibrating ever so slightly, like a heartbeat. I walked over, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air was cold around the fermenter, the kind of cold that chills you to the bone. My breath fogged up as I leaned closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the spigot. I didn't know what I expected, but when the liquid flowed out, it wasn't beer. It was thick, almost like oil, dark and viscous. The smell hit me like a punch to the gut, rotten, metallic, and something else, something that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the liquid. It pooled on the floor, spreading out in a thin, inky film that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Then I saw it, something moved in the liquid, a ripple that spread out, breaking the surface. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, but then it happened again. A shape, barely visible, shifting and writhing beneath the surface. I froze, every muscle in my body tense as a hand, a pale, skeletal hand, emerged from the liquid, grasping at the air. I screamed and stumbled back, knocking over a stack of kegs. The hand vanished, the liquid stilling as if nothing had happened, but I knew what I'd seen. I grabbed a hose, fumbling with the valve, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I had to get rid of it, whatever it was. I sprayed the liquid, watching as it thinned and disappeared, leaving no trace behind. But the fermenter still pulsed, a low, rhythmic thrum that I could feel in my bones. I knew then that it wasn't just the beer. Something had tainted it, something dark and malevolent, and it wasn't going to go away on its own. I decided right then to destroy the batch, to dump it all and scrub the fermenter clean. The next day, I dragged the fermenter outside, the sun glaring down as I opened the drain. The liquid poured out, but it was no longer thick and dark. It was clear now, almost like water, but the smell was still there, that sickening, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. I watched as it soaked into the ground, a dark stain spreading out across the gravel. But as the last of the liquid drained away, I noticed something in the bottom of the fermenter, something that made my blood run cold. A shape, curled and twisted, like a body folded in on itself. I leaned closer, my hands gripping the edge of the fermenter, and then it moved. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. It was impossible. There was no way something could be alive in there. But as I watched, the shape unfurled, long, spindly limbs stretching out, a head lifting slowly. It looked up at me with hollow, sunken eyes, its mouth opening in a soundless scream. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the gravel, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I was back inside. The door slammed shut behind me. I called the police, my hands shaking as I dialed. I didn't know what to tell them, didn't know how to explain what I'd seen. They arrived within minutes, their lights flashing outside the brewery. I led them to the fermenter, my heart in my throat as they peered inside. But there was nothing there. The fermenter was empty, clean, no trace of the liquid, no sign of the twisted shape I'd seen. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew something was wrong. I tried to go back to normal after that, but the brewery felt different, darker. The shadows seemed longer, the air heavier. I kept the doors locked, the lights on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And the dreams, they only got worse. I saw the shape in every shadow, heard its whisper in every creak of the building. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the terror that gripped me. I knew I had to get out, to leave the brewery behind, but something kept me there, some dark force that held me in its grasp. And then, one night, it all came to a head. I was in the office, staring at the security monitors, my eyes bleary from lack of sleep. The brewery was dark, empty, but I felt it, that presence lurking just out of sight. I switched between cameras, my heart racing, and then I saw it. In the back room, near the fermenters, a shadow moved, long and thin, stretching across the floor. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow shifted, twisting, and then I saw it, a figure, hunched and emaciated, crawling towards the camera. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear as it moved closer, its head lifting slowly. It looked up at the camera, its eyes black pits, its mouth opening in a twisted smile. I could see its teeth, sharp and glistening, its tongue flicking out like a snake's. I screamed and turned away, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the phone. I had to call someone, anyone, but when I looked back, the screen was blank, the figure gone. I don't know what happened after that. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, I was outside, the sun rising over the horizon. The brewery door was open, the air inside cold and still. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, and then I saw it. The fermenter was gone, the space where it had stood empty. I walked to the back room, my legs trembling, and there it was, lying on the ground. A body. I don't know how to describe it. It was twisted, contorted, the limbs bent at unnatural angles. The skin was pale, almost translucent, the eyes wide and unseeing. And the mouth, that horrible, gaping mouth, was frozen in a silent scream. I turned and ran, my stomach churning, my mind reeling. I don't remember much after that. The police came, the brewery was shut down, and I was questioned over and over again. But I didn't have any answers. I still don't. All I know is that Batch 13 was cursed, tainted by something dark and evil. And now it's gone, the brewery abandoned, the doors locked. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear it, that faint, rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat. And I know that whatever was in that fermenter, whatever I saw that night, it's still out there waiting for the next brewer to make a mistake. I've always been a decent shot, not the best, not the worst, but enough to hold my own in competitions and not embarrass myself at the range. It was my escape. My way of shutting out the world and focusing on something that required precision and control. The smell of gunpowder and the echoing shots felt like home to me, the only place where I felt truly in control. It started as a regular day at the range. I had my trusty rifle, the same one I've been using for years. The weight of it was familiar, almost comforting. I lined up my shot, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet punched a hole right through the bullseye, a perfect hit. I felt a sense of satisfaction wash over me. I was on my game today. Shot after shot, I hit the mark, each bullet landing where I wanted it. But then something strange happened. On my fourth or fifth shot, I aimed slightly to the left, trying to practice my grouping. The shot rang out, but when I looked through the scope, the hole was dead center again. I frowned, convinced I must have misjudged my aim. I aimed further left this time, deliberately pulling the shot. But again, it landed right in the center. What the hell? I muttered to myself, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. It was as if the bullet had a mind of its own. I shook it off, blaming it on fatigue or maybe just nerves. But the unease lingered. The next few days, I couldn't get the thought out of my head. I went back to the range every day, trying to replicate what had happened. I brought different guns, different calibers, even switched lanes. But it was always the same target, lane 13. Every shot, regardless of where I aimed, hit the same spot. Dead center. It didn't make sense. I told a few of my friends at the range, but they just laughed it off, saying I was finally getting the hang of things, that I should be proud. But it wasn't pride I felt, it was fear. There was something unnatural about it. I started testing it more rigorously, intentionally missing by a wide margin. I shot at different targets, but when I went back to lane 13, every bullet still found its way to that one spot. I even took a break for a few days, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I returned, the eerie accuracy was still there. By this point, my curiosity had morphed into a cold dread that settled in my gut. One evening, as I was packing up, a man approached me. He was older, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed too sharp for his age. He looked like he'd seen more than his fair share of life's darker sides. "I saw what you were doing," he said quietly. His voice was rough, like gravel. "You need to stop." I looked at him, confused and a little defensive. "What do you mean?" "That target," he said, nodding toward lane 13. "It's not normal." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you know about it?" He glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. "They say there's something wrong with that lane, that it's cursed. Folks who shoot there, things start happening. Strange things." I wanted to laugh it off, to call him crazy, but the fear in his eyes made me pause. "Like what?" "Like bullets hitting the same spot every time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like seeing things that aren't there, hearing voices that no one else can. It's like the target is alive, like it's drawing something from the people who shoot at it." I felt the blood drain from my face. What happened to those people? He shook his head. "Some just stopped coming. Others, well, they say they went mad. Started seeing the target everywhere they went. Couldn't get away from it." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're still sane enough to leave," he said, his gaze piercing into mine. "Whatever it is, it's not worth it." I wish I could say I took his advice, that I walked away and never looked back. But something about that target had wormed its way into my mind. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch. I had to know why. Why me? Why that target? I spent hours at the range, trying to break the curse or whatever it was. I even tried shooting with my eyes closed, but the result was always the same. I began to dream about the target, about the hole in the center, growing larger, darker, until it was a void that swallowed everything. My friends started to notice the change in me. I was jumpy, irritable. I stopped hanging out, stopped answering calls. All I cared about was that target. It was like a sickness, a poison that was spreading through my mind. I couldn't think about anything else. I knew I was losing it, but I didn't care. I had to see it through. I started going to the range late at night when no one else was around. It was just me and the target, the fluorescent lights casting an eerie glow over the empty lanes. One night, as I lined up another shot, I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The range was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I turned back to the target and froze. There, in the dim light, was a figure. It was faint, almost transparent, standing just behind the target. It was a man, his features blurred, but I could see the outline of his body, the way he raised his arm like he was holding a gun. My heart pounded in my chest. I blinked, and he was gone. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I wanted to leave, to run and never come back, but my feet were glued to the ground. I lifted the rifle, my hands shaking, and fired. The bullet hit the center, and I saw the figure stagger back as if struck. I blinked again, and he was gone. I lowered the rifle, my breath coming in gasps. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew it wasn't good. I didn't go back for a week. I told myself I was done, that I didn't need to know. But the dreams kept coming, more vivid, more terrifying. The figure was in them, always standing at the target, always staring at me with eyes that were black pits. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I knew what I had to do. I had to end it, one way or another. I went back to the range that night, my hands shaking as I set up in lane 13. The figure was there, faint but visible, his eyes locked on mine. I lifted the rifle, aiming for his chest. "I don't know what you are," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But I'm not afraid of you." I squeezed the trigger, and the shot rang out. The bullet hit the center, and the figure crumpled, disappearing into the darkness. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. The target, it was changing. The hole in the center was growing, spreading like a stain. I watched in horror as it became a black void, a swirling darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I dropped the rifle and stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The void was growing, spreading out from the target, reaching for me. I turned and ran, not looking back, my feet pounding on the concrete floor. I don't go to the range anymore. I tried to move on, to forget, but it's always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I still see the target sometimes, in the corner of my eye, in the reflections of windows and mirrors. It's always there, always watching. I've tried to get help, but no one believes me. They say it's just stress, just my mind playing tricks. But I know the truth. That target, it's alive, it's waiting for me. I don't know what it wants, but I can feel it pulling at me, drawing me back. I don't know how much longer I can resist. Every day, the urge to go back grows stronger, the dreams more vivid. I know it's only a matter of time before I give in, before I go back to the range, to lane 13, to that cursed target. And when I do, I know I won't come back. The last thing I want to say is this: if you're ever at the range and you see an empty lane, just walk away. Don't ask questions, don't let curiosity get the better of you. Because some targets aren't meant to be shot at, some things are better left alone. And some curses, they never end. The first time I noticed the message on the rock, I was guiding a group of tourists down the river. It was a typical sunny day, and the water was calm, perfect for a leisurely paddle. We had just rounded a bend when I saw it. 4 words crudely carved into the face of a large, flat rock near the riverbank. "Do not go further." I pointed it out to the group, making light of it, assuming it was some local's idea of a joke or an old warning to kayakers about rough waters ahead. Everyone had a good laugh, and we continued down the river without much thought. It wasn't until later that evening, sitting around the campfire, that the words began to haunt me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the warning was meant for me. The words seemed urgent, like someone had carved them in a rush, desperate to get the message out. I convinced myself it was just my overactive imagination, a side effect of too many ghost stories shared with fellow guides during late-night campfire sessions. But deep down, a sliver of unease had been planted in my mind, and I knew I'd have to check it out again the next day. The following morning, I took my kayak out alone, eager to get a second look at the rock before any groups came by. The sky was overcast, and the water had a strange, oily sheen to it, almost like the river itself was warning me to turn back. Ignoring the uneasy feeling in my gut, I paddled on. When I reached the bend, the rock was still there, but the message had changed. "You should not be here." My blood ran cold. There was no sign that the rock had been disturbed, no new scratches, no debris. It looked like the words had always been there, as permanent as the rock itself. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was still half asleep, or that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the words were clear and unmistakable. 1,000 thoughts ran through my head. Who could have done this? And why? I was certain no one else had been down this part of the river since we passed by yesterday. It was too remote, too hidden. And yet, the message had changed. Someone or something was trying to tell me something, and it didn't want me to ignore it. I pushed back the fear gnawing at my insides and paddled closer, my eyes scanning the rock for any other clues. As I reached out to touch the carving, a sudden chill ran through me, and the air around me seemed to thicken, like the world was holding its breath. Then I heard it. A low whisper, almost drowned out by the sound of the river rushing past. "Leave." I yanked my hand back and nearly tipped the kayak in my haste to put some distance between myself and the rock. The whisper was gone, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the river's steady flow. I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew one thing: I had to leave. I turned my kayak around and paddled back upstream, my heart racing the whole way. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on my job, but the messages on the rock consumed my thoughts. I'd find myself zoning out in the middle of tours, my mind drifting back to the strange carvings and the whisper that had chilled me to my core. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying. I'd dream of the river pulling me under, of cold hands dragging me down into the dark, and always, always, the message on the rock. I became obsessed. Every spare moment I had, I'd take my kayak down the river, hoping to catch the message changing again, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Each time, I found something different carved into the rock, the warnings growing more urgent, more personal. Stop coming back. It's watching you. You can't escape. The words were different, but the meaning was always the same. I was being warned away, and the threat was becoming more real, more menacing. But instead of scaring me off, it only fueled my obsession. I had to know who or what was behind this. It was late one evening, just as the sun was setting, when I decided to make one last trip to the rock. The sky was painted in shades of blood red and deep purple, and the river looked almost black in the fading light. A sense of finality settled over me as I paddled towards the bend, like I was approaching some invisible line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The rock loomed ahead, its surface slick with moisture from the river's spray. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but the need for answers pushed me forward. As I got closer, I saw the new message, and my heart skipped a beat. "This is your last warning." Before I could process the implications, the air around me grew icy, and the river's current seemed to pick up, pulling me towards the rock. I dug my paddle into the water, trying to fight the pull, but it was no use. It was like some unseen force had grabbed hold of my kayak and was dragging me towards the rock. And then I heard it again, the whisper, louder this time, filling my head with a sense of dread so intense I could barely breathe. "Leave, before it's too late." I looked around wildly, but there was no one there, nothing but the darkening river and the oppressive silence of the wilderness around me. I was alone. Completely, utterly alone. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't fight the current. It was too strong, too relentless. I was being pulled towards the rock, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced down at the water, half expecting to see some monstrous hand reaching up to drag me under. But there was nothing there, just the cold, dark water churning faster and faster as I was pulled towards the rock. I was almost there, so close I could see the deep grooves of the carvings, the jagged lines that seemed to pulse with some malevolent energy. Desperation clawed at me, and I swung my paddle at the rock, trying to break free of the force pulling me in. But the moment the paddle touched the rock, it shattered, splintering into pieces that were swallowed by the river. A cry of terror escaped my lips as the kayak slammed into the rock, nearly capsizing from the impact. I scrambled to grab onto something, anything, but my hands slipped on the wet surface, and I fell into the water. The cold hit me like 1,000 knives, and the current dragged me under before I could even take a breath. I fought to the surface, gasping for air, but the river seemed to be alive, pushing me towards the rock, forcing me closer and closer to the words that had become my obsession. And then I saw it, another carving, barely visible under the water. My heart stopped as I read the words, the final message meant for me and me alone. "You belong here." The words echoed in my mind, drowning out the roar of the river, the frantic beating of my heart. I tried to scream, but the water rushed into my mouth, silencing me, filling my lungs with its icy grip. I was being dragged down into the dark, the rock pulling me closer, the words wrapping around me like chains. I clawed at the surface, desperate for air, for light, for anything that wasn't the crushing darkness, but it was no use. I could feel the rock beneath me now, rough and unyielding, the carvings digging into my skin as I was pressed against it. And then, just as I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, something broke through the darkness. A shape, indistinct and shadowy, hovering just beyond my reach. I blinked, my vision blurring, and realized with a start that it was a figure, a person, standing on the riverbank. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold surface of the rock, and the figure stepped closer. I tried to call out, to beg for help, but the words died in my throat as the figure's face came into focus. It was me. I was standing there, on the bank, watching myself drown. My eyes were cold, empty, staring down at the struggling figure in the water with a detached curiosity. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all I could do was watch as my doppelganger turned away and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. I was alone again, the river's grip tightening around me, pulling me down into the dark. The last thing I saw before the world faded to black was the message on the rock, glowing with an eerie light. Welcome home. I woke up on the riverbank, coughing up water, my body shivering uncontrollably. I had no idea how I got there, no memory of breaking free from the river's grip. All I knew was that I was alive, and the rock was still there, looming over me like some ancient sentinel. The message was gone. The rock was blank, its surface smooth and unblemished. I stared at it, my mind struggling to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it all? Had the river played some cruel trick on me, twisting my thoughts until I couldn't tell reality from nightmare? But then I felt it, the cold, creeping sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the trees, the water, the sky, but there was no one there. Nothing but the silence of the river and the whisper of the wind. I knew then that I couldn't stay. I had to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady, and began to walk back towards my kayak. The river seemed to watch me, its surface calm and untroubled, as if daring me to return. I didn't look back as I paddled away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the camp, my hands trembling as I pulled the kayak onto the shore. I told myself I was done, that I'd never go back, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The river had let me go, but the rock was still there, waiting. And the message, whatever it was, would be there too, changing, shifting, calling me back. I quit my job a week later. I told everyone it was burnout, that I needed a break, but the truth was, I couldn't stand being near the river. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the message, the cold, empty eyes of my doppelganger watching me drown. I moved away, far from the river, far from the rock. But no matter how far I went, the feeling followed me, a shadow that clung to my every step. I stopped sleeping, terrified that I'd wake up back on the riverbank, the rock looming over me, the message waiting. One night, as I lay awake in my small, dark apartment, I heard it, the whisper, faint and distant, but unmistakable. Come back. I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent. Come back, you belong here. I don't remember getting in the car. I don't remember driving back to the river. All I know is that one moment I was in my bed, and the next I was standing on the riverbank, staring at the dark water, the rock a shadowy silhouette against the night sky. The message was back, carved deep into the rock, glowing with that eerie, otherworldly light. You can't escape. I stepped closer, the river whispering around me, the words pulling me in, drawing me closer. I knew then that I'd never be free. The rock, the river, they were part of me now, a curse I couldn't outrun. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning in my lungs, and stepped into the water. It was icy, numbing, but I didn't stop. I walked deeper, the river swallowing me, pulling me down into the dark. The last thing I saw before the water closed over my head was the rock, the message changing one last time. Welcome back. And then there was nothing but darkness. I've been working as a snake handler at the zoo for about 3 years now. It's not the kind of job people usually dream of as kids, but for me, it's been a perfect fit. I've always been fascinated by snakes, the way they move, the way they seem to be aware of everything around them. There's something almost mystical about them. My day-to-day involves feeding, cleaning, and sometimes handling the snakes for educational shows. Most of them are pretty laid back, just basking in their enclosures or hiding in their little caves. But there's this one snake, a black mamba named Callie, who's different. From the moment I started working at the zoo, I could tell there was something strange about her. Callie wasn't like the other snakes. She was more active, more aware. But what really set her apart was the way she watched me. Whenever I entered the reptile house, her eyes would follow me. I mean, really follow me. She'd twist and turn her body just to keep me in her sight. It was unnerving at first, but I shrugged it off as just a curious snake being curious. Over time, though, it became hard to ignore. No matter where I went in the reptile house, her eyes would be on me, like she was waiting for something. The other handlers noticed it too and would joke about it, calling her my stalker snake. I laughed along, but deep down, it bothered me. One day, I decided to stay after hours to try and figure out what was going on with her. The zoo was closed, and the only sounds were the distant calls of animals settling in for the night. I stood in front of Callie's enclosure, watching her watch me. Her eyes were like black pearls, reflecting the dim lights of the reptile house. "Why do you keep staring at me?" I whispered, feeling a little silly for talking to a snake. She didn't move. She just kept looking at me, her tongue flicking in and out as if tasting the air. I felt a chill run down my spine. I was about to turn away when something strange happened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and the lights flickered. I thought it was just a power surge, but then I noticed something even stranger. Callie wasn't in her usual position. She had moved closer to the glass, her head pressed against it, her eyes boring into mine. I froze. I knew it wasn't possible. Her enclosure was locked, and there was no way she could have moved so fast. But there she was, closer than she should have been, her gaze intense and almost human. I backed away, my heart pounding. "Okay, that's enough for tonight," I muttered and quickly left the reptile house, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty zoo. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw hers staring at me with that unsettling intensity. When I finally did fall asleep, my dreams were filled with snakes. They were everywhere, coiling around me, suffocating me, their eyes reflecting the dim light just like Callie's. The next day, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease as I went back to work, but things only got weirder. I was cleaning Callie's enclosure when I noticed something etched into the dirt on the floor of her habitat. It looked like letters, almost like someone had written a message. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat as I read it. "Help me." I stumbled back, my mind racing. It wasn't possible. Snakes couldn't write. Maybe someone was playing a prank on me, but who would do something like that? I glanced around, but there was no one else in the reptile house. I looked back at Callie. She was in her usual spot, coiled up, her eyes fixed on me as always. I took a deep breath and decided to check the security footage later. Maybe it would show who was messing with me. But when I reviewed the footage that night, my heart nearly stopped. It showed me entering the enclosure, then a glitch, a moment of static, and the message was there. No one else had entered. The message had just appeared. I couldn't make sense of it, but one thing was clear. Something very wrong was happening. I tried to tell my boss about it, but he just laughed it off. "Maybe you've been working too hard," he said, patting me on the back. "Take a day off. Relax." But I couldn't relax. I felt like I was losing my mind. Over the next few days, the message in Callie's enclosure changed. "Help me" turned into "free me," and then "soon." Each time, the letters were bigger, clearer, almost as if Callie was getting better at writing. I avoided the reptile house as much as I could, but it was impossible to stay away completely. Every time I went in, I could feel her eyes on me, following my every move, the unspoken message clear. She wanted something from me. I started having nightmares again, more vivid and terrifying than before. I was trapped in a dark place, surrounded by snakes. They whispered to me, their voices soft and hissing. "Free us, free her." One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, the words echoing in my mind. I knew what I had to do, even if it terrified me. I had to find out what was going on with Callie. I returned to the zoo after hours, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door to the reptile house. I made my way to Callie's enclosure, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. She was waiting for me, as always, her eyes reflecting the dim light. I took a deep breath and unlocked the enclosure, my hands trembling. The door swung open and Callie slithered out, her movements graceful and deliberate. She didn't attack me or try to escape. Instead, she just looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite understand. Was it gratitude? Fear? Anger? I followed her as she moved through the reptile house, leading me to a corner I'd never paid much attention to. She stopped in front of a small, unmarked door, her body coiling and uncoiling as if urging me to open it. I hesitated, but something inside me knew that this was what she wanted. I reached for the handle and pulled the door open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. I glanced back at Callie, but she was already slithering down the steps, disappearing into the shadows. With a deep breath, I followed her. The air grew colder as I descended, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The walls were damp, and I could hear the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. I had no idea where I was going, but there was no turning back now. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. It was empty, except for a single old wooden table in the center. On the table was a dusty, tattered book. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I flipped through the yellowed pages. The book was filled with strange symbols and drawings, none of which I could understand. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on one of the pages, was a drawing of Callie. The detail was uncanny, right down to the pattern of scales on her body. And beneath the drawing, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "She watches, she waits." I looked up, my heart racing, and saw Callie watching me from the corner of the room. Her eyes were glowing, almost as if she was trying to tell me something. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, caught in something far beyond my understanding. I turned back to the book, flipping through the pages frantically, searching for answers. And then I found it. A passage that sent chills down my spine. "The serpent is bound by the will of man. Free her, and she will show you the truth. But beware, for the truth is not always what it seems." I stared at the words, my mind racing. Was this what Callie wanted? To be freed? But what did that mean? I looked back at her, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen before: desperation. I knew I had to do something, but I was terrified. I didn't know what would happen if I freed her, or even how to do it. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that this was what I was meant to do. With shaking hands, I reached out and touched her head. Her skin was cool and smooth, and she didn't pull away. I closed my eyes, focusing on the strange connection I felt with her, and whispered, "I free you." The moment the words left my lips, the room seemed to vibrate, the air crackling with energy. I opened my eyes and saw Callie glowing, her body twisting and writhing as if she was shedding her skin. I stumbled back, watching in horror and awe as she transformed. When the light faded, she was gone. In her place stood a woman, tall and beautiful, her eyes the same dark, piercing eyes that had watched me for so long. She smiled, a smile that sent chills down my spine, and stepped closer. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic. "You have freed me." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I was too stunned, too terrified to move. She reached out and touched my cheek, her hand warm and gentle. "But there is a price for everything," she said, her smile widening. "And now you must pay yours." Before I could react, she leaned in and whispered something in my ear, something that made my blood run cold. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the dark, empty room. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. I rushed back up the stairs, my heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. I wanted to believe that it was all just a nightmare, that I hadn't really freed something beyond my understanding. But deep down, I knew the truth. From that day on, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Everywhere I went, I felt her eyes on me, just like Callie's had been. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. It was like she was haunting me, a constant presence just beyond the edge of my awareness. And then, one night, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of my bed. She smiled, the same cold, unsettling smile, and whispered, "It's time." I tried to run, but I couldn't move. It was like my body was paralyzed, held in place by some unseen force. She reached out and touched my forehead, and I felt a searing pain shoot through my skull. The last thing I remember is her eyes, those dark, piercing eyes filling my vision. And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, I was back in the reptile house, lying on the cold, hard floor in front of Callie's empty enclosure. My head was pounding, and I felt weak, like all the energy had been drained from my body. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out, and I collapsed back onto the floor. I looked up at the enclosure, at the spot where Callie used to be, and felt a deep sense of dread. She was gone, but I knew she wasn't really gone. She was still out there somewhere, watching me waiting. And then I heard it, a soft, hissing voice, echoing in my mind. "You freed me, and now you are mine." I screamed, clutching my head, the pain unbearable. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get her voice out of my mind. It was like she was inside me, a part of me controlling me. I don't know how much longer I can take this. I'm losing my mind, losing myself. I can't sleep, can't eat, can't think. All I can hear is her voice, whispering in my ear, telling me things, terrible things. I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if I'm even real. All I know is that I made a terrible mistake, and now I'm paying the price. If you're reading this, if anyone is reading this, stay away from the zoo. Stay away from the reptile house. Stay away from Callie. Because she's not just a snake. She's something else. Something ancient and powerful and evil. And she's watching. Always watching. I've been a film critic for nearly 15 years now. I've seen just about everything there is to see in the world of cinema, from the avant-garde masterpieces to the low-budget B-movies. I'm not easily fazed, but there's one movie that's haunted me for the past 6 months, a film that defies everything I know about storytelling, logic, and reality itself. It all started when I received an unmarked DVD in my mail. No cover, no title, just a sticky note with a scribbled message, "Watch this." At first, I thought it was some kind of promotional material, probably sent by an aspiring filmmaker looking for a review. But there was no return address, no contact information, just the note and the DVD. I popped it into my player that evening, out of curiosity more than anything else. The movie started with a plain black screen and the title "The Final Cut" in simple white text. There were no opening credits, just a slow fade into the first scene. The plot was straightforward enough. A man named David was trapped in a decrepit, isolated house. He received a letter telling him to stay inside if he wanted to survive. The whole movie revolved around him trying to escape this mysterious force that seemed to be watching him from every corner of the house. He tried the doors and windows, but they were always locked or led back into the house. The tension built up to a final climactic moment where David confronted whatever it was that had trapped him. Then the ending came. David, pale and trembling, faced a mirror in the dimly lit hallway. His reflection started to laugh, a cruel, mocking sound that filled the entire house. It was as if the reflection was taunting him, reveling in his hopelessness. The screen went black and the credits rolled. I sat back, slightly disappointed. It wasn't a bad movie, but the ending felt a little too cliché. The evil reflection trope was overused, and I felt like it could have been something more unique. I wrote a few notes and decided to sleep on it before writing a full review. The next day, I felt compelled to watch it again. Maybe I had missed something. I don't know what drove me to it, but I found myself sliding the DVD back into the player. The movie began just as it had before. David was in the house, trying to find a way out. The tension built up, just like last time, and I found myself anticipating the ending scene. But when David reached the mirror, something different happened. Instead of his reflection laughing, it started to cry. Thick, dark tears streamed down its face as it mouthed the words, "You'll never escape." Then David's own eyes filled with tears, and he slowly turned away, accepting his fate. The screen went black, and the credits rolled. I sat there, my mind reeling. That wasn't the ending I had seen before. It was similar, sure, but different in a way that I couldn't quite grasp. Maybe I had imagined it differently the first time, or maybe I was just tired. I shook it off and decided to watch something else to clear my head. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the movie, about David and his despair. The next day, I watched it again. And again, the ending changed. This time, David's reflection didn't do anything. It just stared at him with empty eyes as David screamed and pounded on the mirror, begging to be let out. His voice echoed through the house, growing more frantic, more desperate, until it faded into silence. The screen went black, and the credits rolled. I was shaken. I knew now that I wasn't imagining things. The movie was changing. I rewound the DVD, watched the ending over and over, but it was the same each time I replayed it. It only changed when I watched it from the beginning. I became obsessed. I watched the final cut every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times in a row. Each time, the ending was different. Sometimes David would find a door that led to nowhere, other times he'd tear down the walls only to find another room exactly like the one he was in. In one version, he found a phone and tried to call for help, but the line was dead. In another, he simply lay down on the floor and closed his eyes, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The endings were never happy. They were all bleak, filled with hopelessness and despair. But they were different. Always different. I tried to tell my friends about it, but they just laughed it off, saying I was overworked and needed a break. I'd even tried recording the movie on my phone, but every time I played it back, it was just the original ending, the reflection laughing, David's face contorted in fear. It was as if the movie itself was alive, showing me only what it wanted me to see. One night, after what felt like the 100th viewing, I noticed something strange. David wasn't alone in the house. In the background, barely visible, was a shadowy figure watching him. I hadn't seen it before, but it was there, unmistakable. I rewound and played the scene again, but the figure was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was observing me just as I was observing David. The next day, I noticed the figure again, this time closer, lurking just outside the window as David frantically tried to pry it open. I paused the movie, my heart racing. The figure was looking at me. Not at David, but at me. Its eyes were dark, hollow pits that seemed to see right through the screen, right into my soul. I turned off the TV and stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. I knew then that this was no ordinary movie. It was something else. Something that was watching me as much as I was watching it. I didn't watch the movie for a few days after that. I tried to go back to my normal routine, reviewing other films, writing my columns, but I couldn't focus. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark, hollow eyes staring back at me. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what would happen next. I needed to understand what this movie was, why it was changing, what it wanted from me. So I watched it again. This time, the figure was inside the house, standing right behind David as he looked in the mirror. I could see it more clearly now. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly fingers that twitched and flexed as if they were aching to reach out, to touch something. Its face was a twisted mockery of a human's, with a wide, lipless mouth that seemed to be grinning at some private joke. I could barely breathe as I watched it reach out and place a hand on David's shoulder. He shuddered and turned around, but there was nothing there. The figure had vanished, only to reappear in the background, closer to the camera, closer to me. I turned off the TV and sat there in the darkness, trembling. I could feel it now, that presence, watching me from the shadows of my own home. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't want to see it. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I smashed the DVD. I couldn't take it anymore. I broke it into tiny pieces and threw them away, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. A week later, another unmarked package arrived at my door. Inside was a new DVD with a note, "You can't escape." My hands shook as I read the message. I knew I shouldn't watch it, knew that whatever was on that DVD was dangerous, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know. I put it in the player, my heart hammering in my chest. The movie started, the same as before. David was in the house, alone and terrified. But this time, he wasn't trying to escape. He was looking for something. Or someone. I realized with a jolt that he was looking for me. "Help me," he whispered, staring into the camera, into my eyes. "Please help me." I sat there, frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure appeared behind him, its long fingers reaching out, wrapping around David's throat. He gasped, his eyes wide with terror, as the figure tightened its grip. "Please," he choked, his voice barely a whisper, "don't let it take me." I reached out, as if I could somehow touch him through the screen, but it was too late. The figure dragged him away, into the darkness, and the screen went black. I screamed, a raw, desperate sound that tore through the silence of my empty apartment. I grabbed the remote, rewound the movie, watched the scene again and again, but the result was always the same. David was gone, and I knew, deep down, that he wasn't coming back. I don't watch movies anymore. I can't. Every time I turn on the TV, I see those dark, hollow eyes staring back at me, that twisted grin mocking me from the shadows. I don't know what that movie was or why it chose me, but I know this, it's not over. Not yet. I still get letters sometimes, messages scribbled on scraps of paper and slipped under my door. They're always the same. Watch this. But I won't. I can't. Because I know that if I do, I'll see David again, trapped in that house, begging for my help. And this time, I'm afraid I won't be able to look away. I've been a tax preparer for nearly a decade. It's not the most exciting job, but it's stable and, well, numbers don't lie. I always found comfort in that. My clients came to me with their chaotic lives and receipts stuffed in shoeboxes, and I turned that chaos into neat, orderly numbers. It was my thing. I never expected anything to disrupt that sense of order. But then, about a month ago, I noticed something strange. It was a Tuesday, nothing special about it, just another regular day. I had a stack of returns to go through, and I started with the one on top. It belonged to Mr. Thompson, an old client who ran a small bakery downtown. As I was reviewing his return, I noticed a small error in the deductions section. It wasn't a big deal. Everyone makes mistakes. But it struck me as odd because Mr. Thompson was meticulous. He never missed a thing. I corrected the mistake and moved on. But as I reviewed more returns that day, I saw the same error again and again. Mrs. Fields, a widow living off her late husband's pension, had it. So did the local plumber, Mark. And the young couple who had just bought their first home. Each one had misreported the same deduction. At first, I thought it was just a weird coincidence. Maybe they'd all used the same financial software and there was a bug or something. But when I asked them, they all said the same thing. They hadn't made the mistake. No, I double-checked everything, Mrs. Fields said when I called her. I'd even had my son look over it. Mark, the plumber, shrugged it off. I don't know, man. I just filled it out like I always do. It was unsettling, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. I fixed the errors, filed the returns, and moved on. Little did I know, that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the errors kept popping up. At first, it was just 1 or 2 a day. Then, it became 5, 10, 20. By the end of the month, almost every return I handled had the same mistake. I started keeping a list, jotting down the names of clients and the nature of the error. It was always the same. A deduction for a donation to a charity that didn't exist. Children of the Sun, it read. None of my clients remembered making such a donation, and there was no record of it anywhere online. It wasn't just the mistake itself that bothered me. It was the fact that it was spreading. New clients, old clients, even people who hadn't been to my office in years. They all had it. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. I mean, what kind of rational explanation could there be? I reached out to the IRS, explained what I'd been seeing. They were polite but dismissive. It's probably a software glitch, the agent told me. Have you updated your system? Of course I had. I'd done everything, ran virus scans, updated every piece of software, even switched computers, but the errors kept coming. It was as if something or someone was planting them in every return I touched. One night, I was working late in the office, trying to get a handle on the situation. It was past midnight, and the building was empty except for me. I was hunched over my desk, staring at yet another return with the same error when I heard it. A soft, whispering voice. Don't look. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced around the office, but it was empty. I shook my head, telling myself I was just tired. I turned back to my computer screen. Don't look, the voice whispered again, louder this time. I jumped out of my chair, knocking over a stack of files. My eyes darted around the room, but I was alone. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my coat and keys and got out of there as fast as I could. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the voice. It was telling me not to look, but at what? And why? The next day, I came back to the office, determined to find answers. I pulled up all the returns with the error, cross-referenced them, tried to find a link between the clients, anything. But there was nothing. They were from different walks of life, different neighborhoods, even different cities. And then I saw it. A small note scribbled at the bottom of one of the returns. It was faint, barely visible. It read, "They are watching." My blood ran cold. I checked the other returns, and there it was on every single one. The same note, scribbled in the same faint handwriting. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was being watched, like someone or something was always behind me, just out of sight. I decided I needed help. I reached out to an old friend, Tony, who used to work in it for a big security firm. He was a bit of a conspiracy nut, but right now I needed someone like that, someone who'd believe me. Tony came over that night, and I showed him everything. The returns, the errors, the notes. He didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. Instead, he got this serious look on his face. "This is bad, man," he said. "Really bad. You ever hear of a ghost in the machine?" I shook my head. "A what?" "A ghost in the machine," he repeated. "It's an old hacker term. It means a program or code that's hiding in a system, doing things it's not supposed to. But this," he trailed off, staring at the screen. "This is different," he finally said. "It's like something's messing with your returns on purpose, and I don't think it's just a glitch." We spent hours that night going through my computer, checking every file, every line of code. But there was nothing. No viruses, no suspicious activity. It was clean. "Maybe it's not the computer," Tony said after a while. "Maybe it's something else." "What do you mean?" I asked. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I mean, maybe it's not a what. Maybe it's a who." I didn't want to believe him, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Someone or something was deliberately planting those errors, and they were doing it through me. But why? Tony suggested we dig deeper into the charity itself, Children of the Sun. We spent the next few days researching everything we could, but there was nothing. No website, no address, no phone number. It didn't exist. Then, Tony found an old newspaper article from the 1980s. It mentioned a group called Children of the Sun Occult that had been active in the area. They believed in some kind of apocalyptic prophecy and had convinced a bunch of people to donate all their money to their cause. The leader, a man named Victor Crowley, promised salvation to his followers. But the cult ended in tragedy. Crowley and all his followers died in a fire at their compound. It was ruled a mass suicide. My heart sank. It couldn't be. Was I somehow connected to this? Was I being targeted by the ghost of a dead cult? I started digging through my past clients, looking for anyone who might have had a connection to the cult. It was a long shot, but I had to try. After days of searching, I found something. Mrs. Fields, the widow who'd had the error on her return. Her late husband had been a member of Children of the Sun. He'd left the cult a few months before the fire. She never mentioned it, probably because it was a painful part of her past. But it was the connection I'd been looking for. I called her, asked her about it. At first, she was hesitant, but then she told me everything. How her husband had been drawn in by Crowley's charisma, how he believed in the prophecy, and how he'd left just before the end, terrified of what was coming. "It's cursed, you know it," she said, her voice trembling. "Everything they touched. That's why I never told anyone." I didn't want to bring that darkness back. But it was too late. The darkness was already here. After that, things got worse. The voice in my office became more frequent, more insistent. "Don't look," it whispered every night as I tried to work. But I couldn't stop looking. I had to know the truth. Tony tried to help, but he was scared too. He said we were dealing with something beyond our understanding, something evil. Then the dream started. Every night, I dreamt of a man standing in the shadows, his eyes glowing like fire. He didn't speak, just stared at me with this twisted smile. I knew it was Crowley. I could feel his presence, even when I was awake. He was haunting me, trying to drive me insane. I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped going to work, stopped eating, stopped sleeping. I just sat in my dark apartment, listening to the whispers, waiting for them to stop. But they never did. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to the office, determined to confront whatever was haunting me. I sat down at my desk, opened up a blank tax return, and waited. It didn't take long. The screen flickered, and then the error appeared. Children of the Sun. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Who are you?" I whispered. "What do you want?" The room grew cold, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. And then the voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was loud, angry. Look, I didn't know what it meant, but I had to obey. I stared at the screen, and then the words started to change. It was like someone was typing in real time. "You took them away. You broke the circle. Now you must pay." I felt my heart racing. "What are you talking about?" "Children of the Sun," the words read. "We are many. We are eternal. And you will join us." The lights flickered, and I felt something cold brush against my skin. I turned around, but there was no one there. The shadows in the room seemed to move, to stretch toward me. I was terrified, but I couldn't look away. "Join us," the voice whispered, right in my ear. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like something was squeezing my heart. I gasped for air, but it was like the room was closing in on me. I stumbled out of my chair, trying to get away, but the shadows followed me. They wrapped around me, pulling me down. I could hear their voices, hundreds of them, whispering, chanting, "Join us! Join us! Join us!" I screamed, but no sound came out. The darkness swallowed me whole, and I felt myself falling, sinking into a cold, empty void. When I woke up, I was back in my office. Everything was normal. The lights were on. The air was warm. I looked at the clock. It was 9 a.m. Had it all been a dream? I sat up, my head pounding. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. I looked around the room, but there was no sign of the shadows, no whispering voice, just silence. I turned to my computer, half expecting to see the error again, but the screen was blank, the return gone. I breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe it was over. But then I noticed something on my desk. A single piece of paper, folded neatly. I picked it up, my hands shaking. It was a tax return, but not one I'd ever seen before. It was for me. And at the bottom, in that faint, familiar handwriting, were the words, "You are one of us now." I dropped the paper, my heart racing. I looked around the room, but I was alone. The shadows were gone, but I could feel them watching me waiting. I grabbed my coat and ran out of the office, vowing never to come back. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape. The error followed me, appearing in every document I touched, every piece of paper I signed. I've been a plumber for almost 2 decades. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills and keeps me busy. Most of the time, it's leaky faucets or clogged drains, nothing too out of the ordinary. But last week, I got a call that made me question everything I thought I knew about my profession. It was a Wednesday evening, just as I was about to close up shop for the day. My phone buzzed, and I saw a number I didn't recognize. Usually, I let those go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer this one. "Hello, this is Mike's Plumbing Services. How can I help you?" There was a brief pause on the other end, then a woman's voice, soft and a little shaky. "Hi, my name is Rachel. I have a bit of an unusual problem. My pipes, they're making these strange sounds every night. It's like something's, I don't know, moving through them. I've had my fair share of strange complaints over the years, but this one made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up." I tried to keep my voice steady. "What kind of sounds are we talking about?" "It's hard to explain," she replied. "Sometimes it sounds like whispering, and other times it's like something is scratching inside the pipes. And the water, it tastes salty." That last part caught me off guard. "Salty water? Are you on a well?" "No, it's city water," she said quickly. "But this isn't normal. Can you please come and check it out?" I hesitated. My schedule was packed, and I wasn't keen on chasing down strange noises in the middle of the night. But something in her voice made me feel like this was urgent. "All right," I said. "I'll come by tomorrow morning and take a look." "No," she interrupted, almost pleading. "It only happens at night. Can you come tonight? Please, it's getting worse." I glanced at the clock. It was already past 6, and I had planned to have a quiet evening at home. but I sighed and agreed. Okay, I'll be there around 9. Thank you, she whispered and hung up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I wasn't prepared for. Rachel's house was on the outskirts of town, in a quiet neighborhood I hadn't been to before. It was an old 2-story building with peeling paint and overgrown bushes. The kind of place that had probably seen better days decades ago. I parked my van and grabbed my toolkit, feeling a bit uneasy as I approached the front door. The air felt heavy, and the night was eerily quiet. I rang the doorbell, and after a moment, the door creaked open. Rachel was a woman in her 30s, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervous smile. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Thank you for coming, she said, stepping aside to let me in. I know it's late. No problem, I replied, though I wasn't sure I meant it. Show me the problem. She led me through the dimly lit hallway to the kitchen. The house had an old, musty smell, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, even though I knew it was just the two of us. Rachel pointed to the sink. It usually starts around this time, she said, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was just past 9. I turned on the faucet and let the water run. It looked clear enough, but I took a cup and filled it, giving it a cautious sip. My face scrunched up as the taste of salt hit my tongue. You're right, I said, spitting it out. That's not normal. I bent down to check under the sink, looking for any obvious issues, but everything seemed fine. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like whispering. It was coming from the pipes. What the hell? I muttered, pressing my ear closer. The whispering grew louder, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a crowd of people speaking all at once, their voices mingling and overlapping. Rachel was standing behind me, wringing her hands. You hear it too, don't you? I nodded, trying to keep my composure. Yeah, I hear it, but I don't know what it is. I'm scared, she whispered. Every night it gets louder. And there's something else. What? She hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might be listening. I started seeing things, shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. I thought I was going crazy, but now... I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. This was way beyond my usual scope of work. Look, I'll do what I can, but I'm not sure this is something I can fix. Please, she begged, her voice trembling. Just try. I don't know who else to call. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper in the house, so I asked Rachel if there was a basement. She nodded and led me to a door at the end of the hallway. As she opened it, a cold draft hit us, carrying with it the scent of salt water. I frowned. Why does it smell like the ocean down here? I don't know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's been like that for a few weeks now. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I switched on my flashlight and started down the creaky wooden steps, Rachel following close behind. The basement was dark and damp, the walls lined with old wooden shelves filled with dusty jars and broken tools. In the center of the room was a large metal water tank. It looked ancient, like something out of a different century. I walked over to it, the whispers growing louder as I approached. What's this? I asked, shining my flashlight on the tank. I'm not sure, Rachel replied, her eyes wide. It was here when I bought the house. I've never used it. I circled the tank, looking for any signs of damage or leaks, but it seemed intact. I reached out and placed my hand on the metal surface and immediately pulled back, my skin tingling like I'd touched something electric. What the hell? I muttered, shaking my hand. Rachel looked at me with fear in her eyes. What's wrong? It's warm. And there's something inside. She took a step back, her face pale. Inside? What do you mean? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The whispers were now a chorus, echoing around the room, and the tank began to vibrate, a low hum reverberating through the floor. Get back, I said, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her toward the stairs. What's happening? She cried, panic in her voice. I don't know, I said, my heart racing. But we need to get out of here. We scrambled up the stairs, the door slamming shut behind us as we reached the top. I turned the lock, breathing heavily. Rachel looked at me, tears streaming down her face. What is it? I shook my head, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. I don't know. But whatever it is, it's not normal. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about Rachel's house and that strange tank in the basement. I decided to do some research, hoping to find some explanation for what I'd seen and heard. I spent hours online, sifting through old records and articles. Finally, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Rachel's house had once belonged to a man named Edward Marlowe, a sailor who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances almost a century ago. According to the stories, Marlowe had returned from a long voyage with something he had found at sea, something he had locked away in that tank. The locals believed it was cursed, that it had driven Marlowe mad. He had sealed himself in the basement, refusing to let anyone inside. When they finally broke down the door, he was gone, and the only thing they found was that strange metal tank covered in strange symbols and filled with seawater. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding. This was insane. I didn't believe in curses or ghosts, but I couldn't deny what I had experienced in that basement. I knew I had to go back. I had to find out what was inside that tank. That evening, I called Rachel and told her what I had found. She was silent for a long time, then finally agreed to let me come back. I arrived at the house just as the sun was setting. The air was thick with tension, and I could see the fear in Rachel's eyes as she opened the door. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," I admitted, "but we need to know what we're dealing with." We made our way back to the basement, the whispers growing louder with each step. I could feel the vibration in the air, the hum of something ancient and powerful. I walked up to the tank, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I took a deep breath and reached for the latch on the lid. "Wait," Rachel cried, grabbing my arm. What if we're not supposed to open it?" I looked at her, seeing the terror in her eyes. "I have to know." With a shaky hand, I pulled the latch. The lid creaked open, releasing a rush of cold, salty air. I shone my flashlight inside, my heart pounding. The water was dark, almost black, swirling with strange shapes and shadows. I could see something moving just beneath the surface, something big. "What the hell?" I whispered, leaning closer. Suddenly, a hand shot out of the water, gripping the edge of the tank. I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the floor. "Mike!" Rachel screamed, her voice echoing in the small room. I stared in horror as a figure began to pull itself out of the tank, its body wet and glistening, covered in seaweed and barnacles. Its eyes were empty sockets, its mouth open in a silent scream. I grabbed Rachel's arm and pulled her toward the stairs. "Run." We raced up the steps, the creatures wet, slapping footsteps echoing behind us. We burst through the door and slammed it shut, my hands shaking as I turned the lock. "What was that?" Rachel cried, her face pale with fear. I shook my head, trying to catch my breath. "I don't know. But we need to get out of here." We ran through the house, the whispers now a deafening roar, the walls vibrating as if they were alive. I grabbed my keys and yanked open the front door, but as we stepped outside, I froze. The lawn was gone, replaced by a churning black sea. Waves crashed against the front steps, and the salty air burned my throat. "This can't be real," I whispered, staring in disbelief. But it was. The house was surrounded by water, the horizon lost in a thick, impenetrable fog. "We're trapped," Rachel sobbed, clutching my arm. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The creature was still inside, and there was nowhere to run. I turned to Rachel, trying to keep my voice steady. "We have to go back inside." We retreated into the house, the door slamming shut behind us. The whispers were deafening now, filling every corner of the room. "We need to destroy that thing," I said, grabbing a crowbar from my toolkit. "Whatever it is, it's causing all of this." Rachel nodded, her face pale. "How?" I hesitated, thinking of the stories I had read about Edward Marlowe and his mysterious cargo. "We have to break the tank. It's the only way." We made our way back to the basement, my heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. The creature was gone, but the tank was still there, the water inside churning and bubbling like a pot about to boil over. I raised the crowbar, my hands shaking. "Stand back." Rachel took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. I swung the crowbar down with all my strength, the metal clanging against the tank. A crack appeared, and a rush of cold, salty water sprayed out, soaking my clothes. I swung again, the crack widening. The water poured out, flooding the basement floor. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of voices that made my ears ring. "Mike, look!" Rachel cried, pointing at the water. Shapes were forming in the dark liquid, twisted, contorted faces pressing against the surface, their mouths open in silent agony. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but I kept swinging, the tank buckling under the force of my blows. Finally, the tank burst open, the water pouring out in a torrent. The screams rose to a fever pitch, then abruptly stopped, the basement falling silent. I lowered the crowbar, breathing heavily. The water was gone, evaporated into a thin mist that hung in the air like a ghostly fog. "Did we do it?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "I think so," I said, my voice shaky. "I think it's over." But it wasn't. The house seemed to sigh, the tension lifting as the whispers faded away. We stood there in silence, the basement empty except for the broken remains of the tank. "We need to get out of here," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "I don't care what's out there. We can't stay in this house." Rachel muttered, tears streaming down her face. "Let's go." We made our way back upstairs, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The front door was open, the sea gone, replaced by the familiar sight of Rachel's overgrown lawn. I let out a shaky breath. Thank God. We stepped outside, the cool night air washing over us. For the first time in what felt like hours, I felt a glimmer of hope. But then I heard it, the faint sound of waves crashing against the shore. I turned around, my heart sinking. The house was changing, its walls warping and twisting like something out of a nightmare. The roof caved in, the windows shattering as the entire structure seemed to implode, collapsing in on itself. Rachel screamed, grabbing my arm. "What's happening?" "I don't know." I shouted, pulling her back. "Run." We stumbled down the driveway, the ground shaking beneath our feet. I glanced back, my stomach lurching as the house crumbled into a pile of rubble, swallowed by the dark, churning water that rose up from the ground. The sea was back, waves crashing against the shore, the salty spray stinging my eyes. We ran, the water lapping at our heels, but no matter how far we went, the sea followed, closing in around us. "We're trapped," Rachel sobbed, collapsing to her knees. "There's no way out." I looked around, my mind racing. The sea stretched out in every direction, endless and unforgiving. There was no escape. "We have to keep moving," I said, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. "Come on." But it was no use. The water rose higher, the waves crashing over us, pulling us down into the cold, dark depths. I struggled to breathe, my lungs burning as the salty water filled my mouth. I could see Rachel beside me, her eyes wide with terror as the darkness closed in. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I've been fixing things for as long as I can remember. Wires, pipes, leaky roofs, you name it. Most days, the work is pretty straightforward. People call, I fix what's broken, and then I'm off to the next job. But there was this one house that changed everything for me. It started on a rainy Tuesday. My phone buzzed, and I saw an address I didn't recognize. The house was in a part of town where old buildings stood like tired old men, their paint peeling and windows covered in dust. I usually avoided those jobs because they're more trouble than they're worth, but I was low on cash, and the lady on the phone sounded desperate. When I pulled up to the place, it looked worse than I expected. The house was a crumbling Victorian, its once grand exterior now draped in vines and surrounded by an overgrown lawn. I had to push through the bushes just to get to the front door. A woman answered, her eyes wide with worry. She introduced herself as Mrs. Garson. She was in her 50s, with hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in days. She kept glancing around like she was expecting something to jump out of the shadows. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice shaky. "The lights, they've been flickering for days." I had another handyman come by, but it only got worse after he left. I nodded, trying to hide my own unease. "Let's take a look then." The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. A heaviness in the air, like walking through water. The lights were dim, even though it was the middle of the day. Mrs. Garson led me to the living room, where the chandelier above the table flickered weakly. "See," she whispered. I climbed a ladder and started checking the wiring. It was old, frayed in places, but nothing out of the ordinary. I replaced a few wires, tightened some connections, and thought that would be the end of it. But as soon as I flipped the breaker back on, the lights went crazy. They blinked rapidly, in short bursts. I watched, confused, as the flickering seemed almost deliberate, like a message. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just faulty wiring, I told myself. There you go, I said, climbing down. That should do it. Mrs. Garson looked relieved, but the unease never left her eyes. I packed up my tools and left, hoping that would be the end of it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. A few days later, I got another call from Mrs. Garson. This time she sounded more desperate, almost frantic. It's happening again, she said. The lights, they're flickering just like before. I sighed, but agreed to come back. When I got there, she was waiting on the porch, her face pale. I stepped inside and immediately noticed the change. The air felt thicker, colder. The lights were flickering in the same strange pattern, almost like they were trying to communicate. I stood there, watching the lights, and a crazy thought hit me. What if it was a code? I brushed it off as my imagination, but the idea wouldn't leave me. I took out my phone and recorded the flickering, thinking I'd figure it out later. I spent the next few hours going through the house again, checking every wire, every socket. Everything looked fine. I replaced a few more wires, double-checked the breaker, and once again the lights seemed to steady. It should be fine now, I said, but even I didn't believe it. Mrs. Garson just nodded, her eyes distant. As I left, I glanced back at the house. The lights were still on, steady and calm, but the air around it felt charged, like a storm was brewing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the lights, the way they flickered. I pulled out my phone and watched the video I'd taken. The pattern was clear, almost like Morse code. I don't know why, but I started writing down the flashes. Short, long, short, short, long. My heart pounded as I realized it was spelling out something. A word. Help. I dropped the phone, my mind racing. Was this some sort of prank? A coincidence? I tried to rationalize it, but every time I watched the video, it was the same. Help. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't some ghost hunter or detective. I was just a handyman. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was trying to reach out. I went back to the house the next day, even though Mrs. Garson hadn't called. She seemed surprised to see me, but let me in without a word. The house felt different this time. The lights were on, but there was a stillness that made my skin crawl. I've been fixing things for as long as I can remember. Wires, pipes, leaky roofs, you name it. Most days, the work is pretty straightforward. People call, I fix what's broken, and then I'm off to the next job. But there was this one house that changed everything for me. It started on a rainy Tuesday. My phone buzzed, and I saw an address I didn't recognize. The house was in a part of town where old buildings stood like tired old men, their paint peeling and windows covered in dust. I usually avoided those jobs because they're more trouble than they're worth, but I was low on cash, and the lady on the phone sounded desperate. When I pulled up to the place, it looked worse than I expected. The house was a crumbling Victorian, its once grand exterior now draped in vines and surrounded by an overgrown lawn. I had to push through the bushes just to get to the front door. A woman answered, her eyes wide with worry. She introduced herself as Mrs. Garson. She was in her 50s, with hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in days. She kept glancing around like she was expecting something to jump out of the shadows. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice shaky. "The lights, they've been flickering for days." I had another handyman come by, but it only got worse after he left. I nodded, trying to hide my own unease. "Let's take a look then." The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. A heaviness in the air, like walking through water. The lights were dim, even though it was the middle of the day. Mrs. Garson led me to the living room, where the chandelier above the table flickered weakly. "See," she whispered. I climbed a ladder and started checking the wiring. It was old, frayed in places, but nothing out of the ordinary. I replaced a few wires, tightened some connections, and thought that would be the end of it. But as soon as I flipped the breaker back on, the lights went crazy. They blinked rapidly, in short bursts. I watched, confused, as the flickering seemed almost deliberate, like a message. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just faulty wiring, I told myself. "There you go," I said, climbing down. "That should do it." Mrs. Garson looked relieved, but the unease never left her eyes. I packed up my tools and left, hoping that would be the end of it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. A few days later, I got another call from Mrs. Garson. This time, she sounded more desperate, almost frantic. "It's happening again," she said. "The lights, they're flickering just like before." I sighed, but agreed to come back. When I got there, she was waiting on the porch, her face pale. I stepped inside and immediately noticed the change. The air felt thicker, colder. The lights were flickering in the same strange pattern, almost like they were trying to communicate. I stood there, watching the lights, and a crazy thought hit me. What if it was a code? I brushed it off as my imagination, but the idea wouldn't leave me. I took out my phone and recorded the flickering, thinking I'd figure it out later. I spent the next few hours going through the house again, checking every wire, every socket. Everything looked fine. I replaced a few more wires, double-checked the breaker, and once again, the lights seemed to steady. "It should be fine now," I said, but even I didn't believe it. Mrs. Garson just nodded, her eyes distant. As I left, I glanced back at the house. The lights were still on, steady and calm, but the air around it felt charged, like a storm was brewing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the lights, the way they flickered. I pulled out my phone and watched the video I'd taken. The pattern was clear, almost like Morse code. I don't know why, but I started writing down the flashes. Short, long, short, short, long. My heart pounded as I realized it was spelling out something. A word. Help. I dropped the phone, my mind racing. Was this some sort of prank? A coincidence? I tried to rationalize it, but every time I watched the video, it was the same. Help. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't some ghost hunter or detective. I was just a handyman. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was trying to reach out. I went back to the house the next day, even though Mrs. Garson hadn't called. She seemed surprised to see me, but let me in without a word. The house felt different this time. The lights were on, but there was a stillness that made my skin crawl. I walked around, checking the wiring again, but my mind was on the code. Who, or what, was asking for help? I couldn't bring myself to ask Mrs. Garson if she'd seen anything strange. She already looked like she was on the edge. In the attic, I found something that made my blood run cold. An old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, stuck behind a loose floorboard. The headline read, "Family of 4 dies in mysterious fire. Only child survives." I glanced down the article and saw the name Garson. I felt the room spin. Mrs. Garson had mentioned her husband, but never any kids. My hands shook as I read the rest. The fire had started in the middle of the night, the cause unknown. The only survivor was their youngest daughter, who had been away at a friend's house. I put the clipping back and climbed down from the attic. Mrs. Garson was sitting in the living room, staring at the flickering lights. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The lights blinked once, twice, then went dark. Over the next few weeks, I visited the house almost every day. Mrs. Garson seemed more withdrawn, barely speaking. The lights kept flickering in that strange, deliberate pattern, spelling out words I didn't want to read. Help. Trapped. Danger. I tried to tell myself it was just faulty wiring, a glitch in the system, but I knew better. I could feel the presence in the house, a cold, desperate energy that seemed to cling to the walls. One night, I brought a friend of mine, Jake, who knew a bit about codes and old technology. We sat in the living room, watching the lights, trying to decipher the messages. It wasn't just random words anymore. It was sentences. "She's not who she seems. Get out." Jake looked at me, his face pale. "This is messed up, man. You should get out of here." I nodded, but I couldn't leave. I felt like I had to see it through, whatever it was. I tried talking to Mrs. Garson, but she just shook her head, mumbling something about the house being old, that things always broke down. The lights flickered again, and this time the message was clear as day. Leave before it's too late. I finally confronted Mrs. Garson, asked her about the fire, about the messages. Her face went pale, and for a moment I thought she'd faint. "That was a long time ago," she whispered. "The house, it never really recovered. Sometimes I think they're still here." "Who?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "My family," she said, her voice breaking. They're trapped, and I don't know how to help them. I felt a chill run down my spine. All this time, I thought the messages were a warning for me, but they were for her. The lights weren't flickering because of faulty wiring. They were trying to communicate, to reach out. I spent the next few days researching, trying to find a way to help. I talked to anyone who would listen, but no one had answers. The house grew colder, the air heavy with sorrow. One night, I heard a voice, faint, like a whisper in the wind. I'd followed it to the basement, where the air was so cold, I could see my breath. There, in the corner, was a small door, almost hidden behind some old boxes. I opened it, my heart pounding, and found a small, dark room. The walls were covered in scratches, and in the middle of the floor was a single word, carved into the wood. Help. I don't know why, but I kept going back to that house, even when I knew I should stay away. The messages grew more urgent, the lights flickering faster, almost frantic. Get out. Leave. But I couldn't. I felt like I was part of something, like I had to see it through. I tried one last time to talk to Mrs. Garson, but she was gone. I searched the house, but there was no sign of her. I ended up in the basement again, staring at that small, dark room. The air was thick with fear, and the lights were going crazy, blinking so fast I couldn't keep up. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, and that's when the door slammed shut behind me. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The lights outside the room flickered in a mad dance, the shadows on the walls twisting and turning. I could hear whispers, faint and distant, like voices from another world. Then, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was in there. Minutes, hours, it felt like an eternity. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel something watching me, something old and angry. I tried to call for help, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The air grew colder, and I felt a hand, cold and clammy, grip my shoulder. I screamed, but no sound came out. Then the lights flickered on just for a moment. I saw them, Mrs. Garson's family. Their faces twisted in pain, their eyes hollow and empty. They reached for me, their fingers like claws, and I knew, in that moment, that I was trapped. The lights flickered again, spelling out one final message. Welcome home. And then they went out, plunging me into darkness. I could hear them moving closer, feel their cold breath on my neck. I knew I was done for. I don't know if anyone will ever find this. I'm writing it down, hoping someone, someday, will read it and understand. If you ever find yourself in that house, if you ever see the lights flicker, get out. Don't try to help. Don't try to stay. Just run. Because some things can't be fixed. Some things are broken beyond repair. And now, so am I. I never really thought much about my job. It's just a warehouse, a place filled with rows of shelves and crates, a maze of cardboard and metal. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m., which meant I had the place mostly to myself. Just me, my flashlight, and the steady hum of the industrial fans that never seemed to turn off. It was quiet, almost peaceful, until that one night when everything changed. I first noticed the pallet on a Wednesday, the middle of the week when everything was already dragging. I had just finished my third cup of coffee, still feeling groggy when I saw it. A stack of boxes on a wooden pallet, pushed up against the wall. Nothing unusual about that, except I was sure I'd left it in the middle of the aisle the night before. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe one of the day shift guys moved it and forgot to mention it. It happens, right? But then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Each time, the pallet was in a slightly different spot, just enough to be noticeable. A few feet to the left, then a few feet to the right. It was strange, but I convinced myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe the cleaning crew nudged it while mopping, or maybe I just wasn't remembering things correctly. Then, on Friday, things got weirder. I came in as usual, the familiar scent of cold concrete and cardboard welcoming me. But the pallet was gone. Completely gone. I spent nearly an hour searching the entire warehouse, checking every row and corner, but it was nowhere to be found. I asked the other guys the next morning, but no one knew anything about it. They just looked at me like I was crazy. That night, I found the pallet again, back in its usual spot against the wall, stacked high with boxes that hadn't been there before. My stomach did a little flip as I stared at it. There were no footprints, no signs anyone had been there. Just that same stack of boxes, sitting there like it had never left. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Maybe. I decided to mark the floor around the pallet with a piece of chalk. Just a small line, something I'd notice if it moved again. I felt a little silly doing it, but it gave me a sense of control. I finished my shift and left, feeling a bit better. But when I came back the next night, the line was gone. The pallet had moved again, this time all the way across the warehouse. The chalk line was smudged, like something had dragged it across the floor. I stood there, my heart pounding in my ears. This wasn't normal. Someone had to be messing with me, but who? And why? I decided to set up my phone to record. I placed it on a shelf, hidden among the boxes, and aimed it at the pallet. I knew it was against company policy, but I didn't care. I needed to know what was happening. The next morning, I grabbed my phone and watched the footage. At first, everything seemed fine. The pallet sat there, unmoving for hours. Then, around 3 a.m., the lights flickered and the screen went black for a few seconds. When the video came back, the pallet was gone and the camera was shaking like someone had bumped into it. But there was no one there. No shadow, no movement. Just an empty warehouse and that strange, eerie silence. I replayed the video over and over, trying to figure out what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. How could a pallet full of boxes just disappear? And where did it go? That's when I started to feel the presence. It's hard to describe, but it was like the air around me got heavier, colder. I felt like I was being watched, even when I knew I was alone. Every creak of the metal shelves, every rustle of plastic wrap made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was missing something important. I tried to ignore it, to keep working as usual, but the pallet kept moving. Every night, it was in a different spot, sometimes closer to the office, sometimes farther away. I marked the floor again and again, but the lines would always be smeared, erased like they had never been there. Then one night, I found the boxes open. The tape had been peeled back neatly, and the contents were strewn across the floor. Old photos, yellowed with age, of people I didn't recognize. And letters, dozens of them, written in a shaky, spidery hand. They were dated decades ago, long before I ever worked there, and all of them were addressed to someone named Henry. The words were desperate, pleading, someone begging to be forgiven, to be let go. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read them. What were these doing here? And why now? I gathered everything up and shoved it back into the boxes, sealing them with fresh tape. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I just wanted to finish my shift and get out of there. But the next night, the boxes were open again. This time, the photos were spread out on the floor, arranged in a circle, and in the middle of them was a single letter addressed to me. I felt my hands shake as I picked it up, the paper crinkling under my grip. The handwriting was the same, that same jagged scrawl, but the words were clear. You can't ignore this forever. I dropped the letter and backed away, my heart racing. This was insane. There had to be an explanation, some prank, some trick. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something was here, something that wanted me to see, to understand. But what? I didn't sleep that day. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos, those pleading words. I thought about quitting, about never going back, but I knew I had to. I had to figure out what was happening. So, I went back the next night, armed with a flashlight and the phone number of a guy I knew who dealt with strange things. He laughed when I told him what was going on, but he agreed to come by and check it out. He arrived around midnight, looking more amused than concerned. I showed him the pallet, the boxes, the letters. He listened quietly, nodding as I explained everything. Then he walked around the warehouse, muttering to himself, occasionally stopping to touch a shelf or a box. "It's restless," he said finally, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Whatever it is, it's not happy." "Restless? What do you mean?" I'd asked, my stomach nodding. He shrugged. "Spirits, energy, whatever you want to call it. Something's been disturbed, and it's trying to make itself known. You've got two choices. You can ignore it and hope it goes away, or you can try to figure out what it wants." I swallowed hard. "And how do I do that?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You find out who Henry is." and you hope it's not too late. I remember the first call I got about the place. It was a Tuesday morning, and the phone rang as I was just finishing my coffee. "Wilson Pest Control," I answered, sounding more chipper than I felt. "Hi, I've got a bit of a bug problem." A woman's voice crackled on the other end. She sounded frustrated, maybe even a little scared. "We've tried everything, but they just keep coming back, and now they're different." "Different how?" I asked, already pulling up the appointment book. There was a pause, like she was searching for the right words. "They don't look like any bugs I've seen before. Bigger too, and there's just more of them. Can you come take a look?" I sighed, flipping through the pages. Another day, another infestation. "What's your address, ma'am?" She gave it to me, an old house on the edge of town, practically in the woods. I knew the area. It was one of those places people forgot existed. Perfect for bugs, though. "I'll be there around noon," I said, jotting it down. "Thank you," she braved, relief flooding her voice. "Please hurry." The house was a typical old farmhouse, paint peeling off the sides, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. I knocked on the door, and it swung open almost immediately. A woman, probably in her late 30s, with dark circles under her eyes and hair pulled back in a messy bun, stood there. "You must be the exterminator," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm Emily." I nodded and stepped inside, immediately hit by the musty smell of the place. It was like the air was stale, as if it had been trapped there for years. "So, where are these bugs?" She led me through the house, pointing out spots where the bugs had been. I could see dead ones scattered around, but they weren't anything I recognized. They had weirdly shaped bodies, almost like they were twisted, and they were bigger than any bugs I'd seen before. "Have you seen them alive?" I asked, crouching down to take a closer look at one. "Yes," she said quietly. "At night. They move in these patterns, like they know where they're going." I raised an eyebrow. Bugs didn't do that, at least none that I knew of. I set up the usual traps, sprayed all the typical spots, and told her I'd be back in a week to check on things. She looked at me like she wasn't convinced it would work, but I just shrugged it off. Bugs were bugs, right? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the place. I'd been doing this job for over 10 years, and I'd seen my fair share of weird stuff. But those bugs, they were like nothing I'd ever seen before. I told myself I'd see how it went and maybe consult a colleague if they came back. After all, no need to worry about it until there was something to worry about. A week later, I found myself driving back to the house. Emily hadn't called, so I assumed everything was fine. But as soon as I pulled up, I knew I was wrong. She met me at the door, looking even worse than before. Her eyes were wide, almost frantic. "They're worse," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "So much worse." I followed her inside, and my jaw dropped. The bugs were everywhere, crawling along the walls and ceiling, skittering across the floor. And they were bigger now, almost the size of my hand. Their bodies seemed to shimmer, like they were covered in tiny, iridescent scales. "What the hell?" I muttered, backing away from the swarm. "I don't know what to do," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I've tried everything. They won't leave." I shook my head, trying to wrap my mind around what I was seeing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. I grabbed my sprayer and started dousing the place, but it was like they didn't even care. They just kept coming, crawling over each other, covering every surface. I had to get out of there. I stumbled back outside, gasping for air. My heart was racing and my hands were shaking. This wasn't just an infestation. It was something else, something wrong. I spent the next few days researching, trying to find anything that matched what I'd seen. But there was nothing. No species of insect that fit the description, no records of anything like it. I even called a few colleagues, but they just laughed it off, told me I'd been overworked, maybe imagined it. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I had to go back. I stocked up on everything I could think of, industrial-grade chemicals that weren't even legal in most states. I didn't care. I just wanted those things gone. When I arrived at the house, it was like walking into a nightmare. The bugs were everywhere, spilling out of the windows, covering the walls. Emily was nowhere to be seen. I pushed my way inside, spraying everything in sight. The bugs scattered, but it was like they didn't even care. They just regrouped, forming these strange patterns, almost like they were communicating. I made my way through the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out for Emily, but there was no answer. And then I heard it, a faint clicking sound coming from the basement. I hesitated. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to get out while I still could. But I couldn't. I had to know. I pushed open the door to the basement and started down the stairs. The smell hit me first, a sickly sweet stench that made my stomach churn. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve. And then I saw it. In the middle of the basement, there was a massive nest, pulsating with life. The bugs were swarming around it, crawling in and out of the walls. And at the center of it all, covered in those same shimmering scales, was Emily. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the bugs. I froze, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. This wasn't happening. But it was. The bugs started to move, swarming toward me, their bodies writhing and twisting. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. I barely made it up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. I ran outside, gasping for breath. I could still hear her voice echoing in my head. "Help me." I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave her like that, but I couldn't go back in there. Those things, they weren't just bugs. They were something else, something evil. I sat in my truck for what felt like hours, trying to figure out what to do. And then I made a decision. I grabbed the last canister of chemicals, the one I'd brought as a last resort, and headed back inside. The smell hit me again, stronger this time. I gagged, but I kept moving. I could hear the bugs, feel them crawling all around me. I made it to the basement door and took a deep breath. "I'm sorry," I whispered before kicking it open. The bugs surged toward me, but I didn't hesitate. I pulled the pin on the canister and threw it into the basement, slamming the door shut. There was a hissing sound, and then a loud pop, followed by silence. I never told anyone what happened. I didn't know how to explain it, and honestly, I didn't want to. The house was condemned, torn down a few months later. No one knew why, just that it was unsafe. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. Those bugs, the way they moved, the way they seemed to think. And Emily. I still see her face in my nightmares, hear her voice begging for help. I don't know what those things were, and I don't want to know. I quit the pest control business not long after that. I couldn't do it anymore. Every time I saw a bug, I thought of that house, of what I'd seen. I moved to a different town, changed my number. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint clicking sound, like tiny legs skittering across the floor. And I know they're still out there somewhere waiting, because every now and then I get a call, and it's always the same. "Hi, I've got a bit of a bug problem." I never thought much about my job. I was a bicycle courier, just another guy on the streets of the city, weaving through traffic and delivering packages that never meant much to me. The monotony was comforting in a way. I'd pick up the parcels, drop them off, and then grab the next. But everything changed the day I got that first package. It was a rainy Tuesday, and I was soaked to the bone. I had just finished my usual round of deliveries when my dispatcher called. "Hey, I got one more for you," she said, her voice crackling through the earpiece. "It's urgent." "Sure, where's it going?" I asked, wiping the rain from my eyes. "That's the thing," she hesitated. "It doesn't have an address." "What do you mean it doesn't have an address?" "Just come pick it up," she said, her tone firm. "And be quick." I shrugged it off as some kind of mistake. Maybe they'd forgotten to put the label on. When I arrived at the pickup spot, there it was, a small plain box, no bigger than a shoebox, wrapped in brown paper. The only thing written on it was the word EOGNT in bold red letters. I stood there, holding the box, feeling a shiver run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold rain. It felt heavier than it should have been, like there was something in it that shouldn't be. I shook my head and stuffed it into my bag. Maybe it was just some weird marketing thing. I'd seen stranger promotions in the city. I jumped back on my bike and started pedaling, the rain now a dull, distant annoyance compared to the strange, gnawing feeling in my gut. I rode aimlessly for a while, unsure where to go. I kept checking the package, hoping some address would magically appear. But it remained blank, save for that one word, UOGNT. I stopped at a red light, my heart pounding for no reason at all, and then I felt it, a slight vibration from the package. I almost dropped it. What the hell was in there? I was tempted to rip it open right there on the street, but something stopped me. I had no idea what, but I felt compelled to follow through, to deliver this thing somewhere. I don't know why, but I knew I had to get rid of it. I decided to take it to the dispatch office. Maybe they could figure it out. As I rode, the package felt heavier and heavier, like it was trying to drag me down. My legs burned as I pedaled harder, the rain stinging my face. Finally, I reached the office and burst through the door, dripping water all over the floor. "What the hell, man? You're soaked," Jenny, the dispatcher, said as she looked up from her computer. I know, I panted, pulling the package out of my bag and dropping it on the counter. But this thing, it's weird. It was vibrating. She frowned and reached out to pick it up. As soon as her fingers touched it, she pulled back, her face pale. "You should get rid of it," she whispered. "What?" I stared at her. "What do you mean?" "Just take it somewhere, throw it away, I don't care. Just get rid of it." I was confused, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Jenny wasn't the kind to get scared easily. I picked up the package, feeling its weight in my hands, and left the office without another word. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. I found myself riding to the outskirts of the city, the rain turning into a light drizzle. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop. The package was warm now, almost hot to the touch, and the vibrations were stronger. I stopped at an old bridge that led out of town. The river below was dark and swollen from the rain. I pulled the package from my bag and held it over the edge, ready to drop it. But I couldn't. My hands shook, and I felt like I was betraying something deep inside me. I can't explain it. It was just a box, but I couldn't let go. I screamed in frustration and threw it back into my bag, my mind racing. That's when my phone rang. I jumped, fumbling for it with wet fingers. The number was unknown, and I hesitated before answering. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky. "Deliver the package," a voice whispered on the other end. It was low, distorted, like a recording played backward. "Who is this?" I shouted. "What do you want?" "Deliver the package," the voice repeated, then the line went dead. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at the phone like it might explode. I knew then that I couldn't throw the package away. I had to find out where it was supposed to go, who it was for, why it was sent to me. I got back on my bike and started pedaling, not knowing where I was going, just following some invisible pull that I didn't understand. I spent the night riding around, searching for something, anything that would give me a clue. But there was nothing. By morning, I was exhausted and defeated. I went home and crashed on the couch, the package sitting ominously on the coffee table. I fell asleep almost immediately, too tired to care. I woke up to my phone ringing. It was Jenny. "Did you get rid of it?" she asked, her voice tense. "No," I muttered, rubbing my eyes. I tried, but I couldn't. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing, like she was trying to decide what to say. "There's another one," she finally whispered. "What?" "Another package. It's at the office. It's the same as the first one. No address, just urgent." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. I didn't want to go back, didn't want to see that package, but I knew I had to. I had to know what was going on. I biked to the office, feeling like I was in some kind of nightmare. When I got there, Jenny was waiting for me. She looked even worse than before, her eyes sunken and haunted. She handed me the second package, and I felt the same heavy weight, the same strange warmth. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't keep doing this. Something was wrong, something beyond my understanding, and it was getting worse. "I don't want to do this anymore," I said, my voice shaking. "Neither do I," Jenny replied, her eyes fixed on the package. "But we don't have a choice." I left the office with the second package, my mind racing. What was going on? Who was sending these packages? And why me? I spent the day trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to deliver the packages, but I didn't want to just leave them either. I felt trapped, like I was being pulled in two directions at once. By evening, I was exhausted and desperate. I found myself back at the bridge, staring down at the dark water, the 2 packages in my bag. I was about to throw them in when my phone rang again. "Deliver the packages," the voice said, but this time it was different. It was clearer, more insistent. "I don't know where to take them," I yelled, my voice echoing over the water. There was silence on the other end, and then a low chuckle. "You know where to go." I hung up, my hands shaking, and got on my bike. I didn't know where I was going, but I pedaled as fast as I could, following some invisible pull that I couldn't resist. I ended up in front of an old, unmarked building on the edge of the city. It looked abandoned, the windows boarded up and the paint peeling. But I knew this was the place. I could feel it. I walked up to the door, the packages heavy in my arms, and knocked. There was no answer, but the door creaked open. I hesitated, then stepped inside. The air was cold and musty, and the only light came from a flickering bulb at the end of a long hallway. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open with a trembling hand. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, empty except for a table in the center. I placed the packages on the table and stepped back, my heart pounding. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the packages began to shake, vibrating violently. I stumbled back, my eyes wide with fear, and then the room went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor. The room was lit by a single dim bulb, and the packages were gone. I sat up, my head spinning, and looked around. There was no one there, no sign of what had happened. I got to my feet and stumbled out of the building, my mind racing. What was going on? What had I just done? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like I was caught in some kind of twisted game that I didn't understand. I made my way home, feeling like I was in a daze. When I got there, I found a small, plain box sitting on my doorstep. It was wrapped in brown paper, with one word written on it in bold, red letters: urgent. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and took it inside. I knew I should throw it away, get rid of it, but I couldn't. I sat down on the couch, staring at it, my mind racing. I felt like I was on the edge of some terrible revelation, like I was about to understand something that I didn't want to know. I opened the box. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it, my hands shaking, and read the words written in neat, precise handwriting. "Thank you for your service. The deliveries are complete. You may rest now." I stared at the note, my heart pounding. What did it mean? I didn't understand. I felt a wave of fear and confusion wash over me, and then the lights went out. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of my apartment. The room was dark, and the box was gone. I sat up, my head spinning, and looked around. Everything was the same, but different. It was like I was seeing the world through a fog, like everything was muted and distant. I got to my feet, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I felt lost, like I was drifting in some endless void. Then I saw it. There, on the coffee table, was another package. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, with the word urgent written on it in bold red letters. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. I knew I should leave it, get out of there, but I couldn't. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. As soon as I touched it, I felt a strange warmth, a familiar vibration. I knew then that this was the last package, the final delivery. I opened it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside was a small black envelope. I pulled it out, my hands shaking, and tore it open. There was a single small piece of paper inside. I unfolded it, my eyes wide with fear, and read the words written in neat, precise handwriting. "Welcome to the service. Your first package will arrive soon." I stared at the note, my mind reeling. What did it mean? Was this some kind of joke? I felt a wave of panic wash over me, and then my phone rang. I picked it up with trembling hands, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello," I whispered. "Your first delivery is ready," the voice on the other end said. It was calm, almost friendly. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" There was a long silence, and then the voice spoke again, its tone cold and final. "You belong to us now." The line went dead, and I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. I felt a cold dread settle over me, a sense of impending doom that I couldn't shake. I looked around the apartment, my eyes wide with fear, and saw it. There, on the floor by the door, was a small plain box wrapped in brown paper. It was marked urgent. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, my mind racing, and then the lights went out. I don't know how long I lay there in the darkness. Minutes, hours, days, it all bled together. When I finally got up, the box was still there waiting for me. I knew what I had to do. I picked it up, my hand steady now, and opened it. Inside was another package, smaller this time, but just as heavy. I felt the familiar pull, the compulsion to deliver it, to complete the task. I got on my bike and rode through the empty streets, the city dark and silent around me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to keep going. The package grew heavier with each pedal, the weight pressing down on me like a burden I couldn't escape. I reached the old building again, the one I had visited before. I walked inside, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and placed the package on the table. As I stepped back, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The room was dark, but I could see shadows moving in the corners, shapes that shifted and writhed. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, but I couldn't look away. The package began to shake, vibrating violently, and then it exploded in a burst of light. I was thrown back, my head spinning, and when I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of my apartment again. The room was dark, and I felt a strange sense of emptiness, like something had been taken from me. I got to my feet, my mind blank, and looked around. There, on the coffee table, was another package. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, with the word urgent written on it in bold red letters. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. I knew then that this would never end, that I was trapped in some endless cycle of deliveries, forever bound to this strange, dark force that I didn't understand. I picked up the package, my hands trembling, and opened it. Inside was a single small piece of paper. "Thank you for your service." The cycle continues. I stared at the note, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew what I had to do. I picked up my phone and called the dispatcher. "There's a package for you," I whispered, my voice shaking. "It's urgent." I hung up and got on my bike, the package heavy in my bag. I rode through the dark streets, my mind numb, my heart pounding. I knew then that I would never escape, that I would be delivering these packages forever, bound to this dark, endless cycle. And then, as I pedaled through the silent city, I heard the voice in my ear, calm and cold. "Welcome to the service." The line went dead, and I rode on into the darkness, the package heavy on my back, the weight of my fate pressing down on me like a burden I could never escape. The cycle continues. I never considered myself superstitious. My life revolved around precision, logic, and structure. Being a yacht designer, I'd crafted numerous vessels, all of which sailed smoothly, literally and metaphorically. But everything changed when I started working on the Elysium. It all started on an ordinary Monday morning. I was in my office, a cozy corner overlooking the marina, filled with the salty scent of the ocean and the distant sound of seagulls. My desk was cluttered with sketches, rulers, and model ships. I had just been given the most challenging project of my career, a luxurious mega yacht for a billionaire client. The man was eccentric, to say the least, demanding something unique, something that no one had ever seen before. He even had a name picked out, the Elysium. At first, I was thrilled. This was the kind of project that could define a career, something that would set me apart from the countless designers who played it safe. I spent hours sketching ideas, pulling inspiration from historical ships, modern marvels, and even mythological vessels. The design took shape gradually, a sleek, elegant beauty with curves that whispered of speed and stability. But that's when things got strange. I remember the first time it happened like it was yesterday. I had just finished drawing the initial blueprint, a streamlined hull, spacious decks, a grand ballroom beneath a glass dome. As I stepped back to admire my work, I felt a strange chill crawl down my spine. The room seemed to darken slightly, and a sense of unease settled in my stomach. I dismissed it as just fatigue. I had been working non-stop for hours. But then, as I added the final touches, the blueprint started to change. It was supple at first, a faint line, almost like a scratch, appearing along the side of the hull. I frowned, leaning closer, and that's when I saw it. The lines of the ship began to warp, the elegant curves twisting grotesquely. I watched in disbelief as the vessel, in my drawing, started to list, tipping onto its side as if capsizing. I blinked, shaking my head to clear the fog of exhaustion. When I looked again, the blueprint was normal. Perfect, just as I'd left it. I laughed it off, convinced it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But that was only the beginning. Over the next few days, it happened again and again. Every time I drew the Elysium, something would go wrong. I'd sketch out the design, meticulous and precise, but as soon as I was done, the image would distort. The yacht would tilt dangerously in the drawings, waves crashing over its sides, the once pristine decks now splintered and broken. It didn't make any sense. Blueprints don't just change on their own. I checked my tools, replaced my pens, and even switched out the paper, thinking it was some sort of strange interference. But no matter what I did, every time I drew that damned ship, it ended up capsizing on the page. The worst part was, I couldn't show anyone. Who would believe me? Hey, look, my blueprints are haunted. I'd be laughed out of the industry, so I kept it to myself, obsessively redrawing the design, trying to find the flaw, the missing piece that would keep the Elysium afloat. But nothing worked. It wasn't long before I started having nightmares. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, images of the ship sinking, water rushing into its grand holes, pulling it under. In my dreams, I was always on board, feeling the cold water rise around me, hearing the distant screams of unseen passengers. Sleep-deprived and desperate, I decided to consult an old colleague of mine, Peter, who was more into the metaphysical aspects of design. He believed in energies, in the soul of a ship. I always thought it was a bit woo-woo, but I was running out of options. Peter listened intently as I described what was happening. He didn't laugh or scoff, just nodded thoughtfully. When I finished, he leaned back and looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen in years. "You've heard of the concept of a ghost ship, right?" he asked. "A vessel doomed to sail forever, cursed by some tragedy or malevolent force." I nodded slowly, unsure of where he was going with this. "Maybe what you're dealing with is a ghost ship of sorts, but not in the traditional sense. There's something in your design, something that's calling to an energy, a spirit. It's like you're drawing a ship that's meant to sink." I stared at him, feeling a mix of fear and skepticism. "That's insane, Peter." He shrugged. "Maybe. But think about it. Why else would the design keep failing? It's like the blueprint itself is trying to warn you." I didn't want to believe him, but his words stuck with me. I became obsessed with finding out what was wrong. I researched every shipwreck, every nautical disaster I could find, trying to see if there was a pattern, something I was unknowingly replicating. But there was nothing. The client was growing impatient. He didn't care about my excuses or delays. He wanted his yacht, and he wanted it now. I had no choice but to push forward, ignoring the twisted images that haunted my sketches. That's when I met her. She was an elderly woman who came into the office one rainy afternoon. She claimed to be a medium, someone who could communicate with spirits. At first, I thought she was just another cook, but she mentioned the Elysium by name, saying she felt a dark presence attached to it. Desperate, I invited her to take a look at my drawings. She studied them silently for what felt like hours, her eyes narrowing as she traced the lines of the ship with her fingers. Finally, she looked up at me, her face pale. "This ship, it's not meant to sail. It's a beacon, a call to something dark and ancient. If you continue with this, you'll be inviting that darkness into the world." I wanted to laugh, to tell her she was crazy, but there was a conviction in her voice that made my blood run cold. "What do I do?" I asked, feeling helpless. "Destroy the designs. Burn them, every last one. And never draw this ship again." I was torn. If I did that, I'd lose the biggest project of my career, not to mention my reputation. But if I didn't, I took her advice. That night, I gathered all the sketches, the blueprints, every trace of the Elysium, and set them ablaze in my backyard. The flames roared to life, consuming the paper with an almost unnatural fervor. I watched until the last ember died, hoping that would be the end of it. For a while it was. I stopped having the nightmares, and the chill that had settled in my office lifted. I went back to designing other yachts, trying to forget the whole ordeal. But then, a few months later, I got a call. The client had hired another designer, someone younger and eager to prove themselves. They'd taken the old sketches from the backup files and completed the yacht. The Elysium was built. I felt a surge of dread as I heard the news. I wanted to warn them, to tell them everything, but I knew how it would sound. So I kept my mouth shut, hoping I was wrong, that the old woman had been just a crazy coincidence. Then last week it happened. The Elysium set sail on its maiden voyage, a grand spectacle with celebrities and dignitaries on board. But as it reached open waters, the sky darkened. A storm came out of nowhere, fierce and unrelenting. The yacht, with all its grandeur and elegance, capsized. There were no survivors. I watched the news in horror, feeling the weight of guilt crush me. It was my design, my cursed blueprint, that had doomed them all. I could almost hear the voices of the dead, accusing, haunting. Now I'm back in my office, staring at a blank sheet of paper. I can't stop thinking about the Elysium. I can't stop drawing it, over and over again, trying to fix it, to make it right. But no matter what I do, every time I finish, the ship tips over, the waves swallowing it whole. I know I'm losing my mind, but I can't stop. I have to try, to keep drawing, to find a way to save them, even if it's too late. I hear whispers, now faint and distant, growing louder every day. They call to me, beckoning, and I know, deep down, that I'm doomed to follow them. Because some ships aren't meant to sail, and some curses can never be broken. I've been a safari guide in the heart of the African wilderness for over a decade. I know every tree, every trail, and every sound this jungle has to offer. My name is Jake, and if there's one thing I'm certain of, it's that the jungle never stays the same. It's alive, constantly changing. But lately things have been different, disturbingly different. It started subtly. I'd be leading a group through one of the usual trails, talking about the rich biodiversity, pointing out the grazing antelopes or a lunging pride of lions. But they were always a little further back than usual, almost out of sight. I shrugged it off initially, attributing it to mere coincidence. After all, animals are unpredictable. But it kept happening every single time. One afternoon, I was guiding a small group of tourists through the open savanna, the sun blazing overhead, when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. A herd of elephants, usually the most majestic sight on the tour, were standing still at the edge of the tree line, their massive bodies barely visible. They didn't move, didn't graze, just stood there, staring, as if they were waiting for something. Or someone. "Why are they so far away?" one of the tourists asked, her voice tinged with disappointment. I forced a smile. Probably just avoiding the heat. They're smart animals. Let's move on. But even as I said it, I knew something was wrong. Elephants don't behave like that. They're curious, social creatures. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the scorching heat. I decided not to dwell on it too much. Maybe I was overthinking it. A week passed, and the strange behavior continued. Lions would slink away into the bushes, leopards would retreat into the trees, and even the impalas, usually so skittish and alert, seemed almost afraid to come near. It was as if the whole jungle was hiding from us. But from what? One evening, as I was closing up the camp, I noticed something odd. A group of baboons, notorious for causing mischief around the campsite, were perched high up in the trees, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They didn't move, didn't chatter. It was unnerving. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the animals' behavior, the way they seemed to be retreating, watching us from a distance. It felt like they knew something we didn't. Something was coming, and they were giving us a silent warning. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk. The jungle was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of crickets and nocturnal creatures absent. As I wandered near the edge of the camp, I heard a faint whispering. I stopped, straining to hear. It sounded like voices, but there was no one around. "Hello." I called out softly, my heart pounding. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I felt a presence behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. Just the thick, impenetrable darkness of the jungle. I hurried back to my tent, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The next day, I was guiding another group through a dense part of the jungle. The air was thick with humidity, and the sun was barely visible through the canopy of trees. We had just reached a small clearing when I noticed something unusual. There, on the ground, were footprints. Large, unrecognizable footprints. They were unlike anything I'd seen before. Too large to be human, too deep to belong to any known animal in the area. What made those? A tourist asked, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't have an answer. I'm not sure. Probably a large animal, maybe a buffalo. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. These tracks were different, almost human-like, but distorted, as if something heavy and unnatural had walked through the clearing. I felt a shiver of unease run through me. The animals had been acting strange because they were afraid. But of what? We continued the tour, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the dense, oppressive silence of the jungle. A few days later, I decided to investigate the area where I'd found the strange footprints. I took my friend, Alex, another guide with me. We'd hiked through the jungle, the dense foliage making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel my heart racing with every step. We reached the clearing, and there, at the center, was something that made my blood run cold. A large circular depression in the ground, as if something heavy had been standing there. The trees around it were scorched, their bark blackened and charred. What the hell happened here? Alex whispered, his eyes wide with fear. I shook my head, unable to speak. I didn't know. But whatever it wasn't natural. It was as if something had descended from the sky, burning everything in its path. We decided to head back to camp, but as we turned to leave, I heard it again, the whispering. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there, all around us. I looked at Alex, his face pale with fear. Do you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking. He nodded, his eyes darting around the clearing. Let's get out of here, Jake, now. We ran back to camp, not stopping until we were safely inside my tent. I tried to explain to him what I'd been experiencing, the animals, the footprints, the whispers, but he just shook his head. We need to tell the others, he said, his voice trembling. We need to leave. But I knew it wasn't that simple. We were in the heart of the jungle, miles from civilization. And whatever was out there, it wasn't going to let us leave that easily. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder now, closer. I could hear them outside my tent, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, my heart pounding in my chest. Around midnight, I heard a loud crash outside. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled out of my tent, my hands shaking. The camp was in chaos. The tents were torn, the supplies scattered. But there was no sign of Alex. Alex? I shouted, my voice echoing through the darkness. There was no answer. I ran through the camp, searching for him, but he was gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the camp, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, almost impossibly so, its body shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching me. I wanted to run to scream, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in its gaze. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The jungle was silent once more, the only sound the pounding of my heart. I stumbled back to my tent, my mind racing. What was that thing? And what did it want? The next day, I gathered the remaining staff and tourists. We needed to leave, and we needed to leave now. I tried to explain what had happened, but they looked at me like I was crazy. I could hardly blame them. It all sounded insane. But then one of the tourists, a woman named Sarah, spoke up. She'd seen it too, the figure. It had been standing at the edge of her tent, watching her, just like it had watched me. That was enough to convince the others. We packed up as quickly as we could and started the long journey back to the nearest village. But the jungle wasn't going to let us go that easily. As we made our way through the dense undergrowth, I could feel it watching us. The animals had vanished completely, the usual sounds of the jungle replaced by an oppressive, suffocating silence. Then the whispers started again, louder this time, all around us. The tourists were panicking, their eyes wide with fear. I tried to keep them calm, but it was no use. They could feel it too, that presence, closing in on us. We reached the edge of the clearing, and there it was again. The figure, standing at the center, its body shrouded in darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there watching us. "We need to go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But as we turned to leave, the figure moved. It took a step towards us, and then another. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it was savoring our fear. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. "Run!" I shouted, my voice breaking through the silence. We sprinted through the jungle, branches scratching at our faces, the undergrowth tearing at our clothes. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices all around us. I didn't dare look back, my heart pounding in my ears. We burst out of the jungle and into the open savanna, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The village was just ahead, a small cluster of huts at the edge of the river. We were almost there, but as we reached the outskirts, I felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around my arm. I turned, my heart racing, and there it was, the figure, its face inches from mine. Its eyes were empty, hollow, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. I screamed, wrenching my arm free and stumbling backwards. The figure didn't follow. It just stood there, watching us with that hideous smile. We made it to the village, collapsing in a heap on the ground. The villagers gathered around us, their faces filled with concern. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. I could still see its eyes staring into mine. That smile burned into my memory. We spent the night in the village, too terrified to go back into the jungle. But I knew we couldn't stay there forever. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there waiting for us. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of whispering. It was coming from outside my hut, soft and insistent. I froze, my heart racing. It was here. I crept to the door, my hands shaking, and peered out into the darkness. The village was quiet, the only sound the distant murmur of the river. But then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the village, its body silhouetted against the moonlit sky, was the figure. It was watching me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I felt a surge of terror, but also a strange sense of resolve. I couldn't run from this thing forever. It had taken Alex, terrorized us, driven us from our camp. I needed to know what it was, what it wanted. I stepped out of the hut, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, just watched me with those empty, hollow eyes. I took a deep breath and walked towards it, my legs trembling. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head, its mouth opening in that grotesque smile. And then it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural whisper, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. "I am the jungle." The words sent a chill down my spine. I took a step back, my mind reeling. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. It was the jungle itself, a malevolent force that had been watching us, waiting for us. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure's smile widened, and it took a step towards me. "You do not belong here." I felt a surge of fear, but also a strange sense of understanding. This thing, this entity, was protecting its territory. We had intruded, disrupted the balance, and now it was reclaiming its own. I turned and ran back to the hut, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. I could feel it behind me, its presence closing in, suffocating. I burst into the hut and slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were all around me now, the walls vibrating with the sound. I closed my eyes, my hands covering my ears, trying to block it out. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The hut was silent, the air still and heavy. I opened my eyes, my heart racing. The figure was gone, but I knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, we decided to leave. The villagers offered to take us to the nearest town, and we accepted gratefully. As we made our way down the river, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced back at the jungle, its dark, impenetrable depths looming over us. We reached the town by nightfall, exhausted and shaken. The villagers bid us farewell, their eyes filled with pity. They knew what we had faced, what was waiting in the jungle. I tried to go back to my old life, but I couldn't. The memories haunted me, the whispers echoing in my mind. I moved to a small town far from the jungle, hoping to escape its grasp. But the jungle wasn't done with me. One night, I woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked around the room. It was empty, the shadows stretching across the walls. And then I saw it. Standing at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, was the figure. It smiled that grotesque smile, its mouth twisting in a way that seemed almost familiar. "I am the jungle," it whispered, its voice sending a chill down my spine. I felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around my arm, and then everything went black. I never woke up again. The jungle had claimed me, just as it had claimed Alex. I was a part of it now, a whisper in the wind, a shadow in the darkness. The jungle never forgets, never forgives. It watches, it waits, and it always gets what it wants. I've been a ski instructor in the Rockies for over a decade, and you'd think I've seen it all by now. But this winter, something happened that still makes my blood run cold every time I think about it. It was late January, and the resort was packed with tourists trying to make the most of the heavy snowfall we'd gotten that week. The conditions were perfect, almost too perfect. You see, when the snow is fresh like that, it's beautiful but also dangerous. Avalanches become a real risk, especially in the off-piste areas where the snow is untouched. It was a typical morning. I was on my way to the lodge for my first lesson of the day when I noticed a group of skiers huddled together, talking in hushed voices. Curious, I skied over to see what was going on. "Morning, folks. Everything all right?" I asked. They turned to me, looking pale and uneasy. One of them, a middle-aged guy with a nervous expression, pointed towards the tree line off to the side of the main slope. "Over there, by those trees, we saw something weird," he said. I followed his gaze and spotted a set of footprints in the snow, leading away from the designated trails and heading straight into the backcountry. The tracks were strange. They were deep and spaced far apart, like whoever made them was either really heavy or carrying something. "Did you see who made these?" I asked, squinting at the tracks. They all shook their heads. Another woman spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "We were on the lift and saw the footprints appear out of nowhere. There was no one there, just the tracks." Now, I've heard some crazy stories from tourists, especially after they've had a few drinks at the lodge, but this was different. The fear in their eyes was real. I nodded, trying to keep my own voice steady. "All right, I'll check it out. You guys go back to the lodge, okay?" They hesitated but eventually shuffled away, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. I took a deep breath and skied over to where the tracks began. They started just beyond the marked boundary of the resort, which was already odd. It was like someone had just dropped out of the sky and started walking. I followed the footprints cautiously, my skis crunching softly in the untouched snow. The tracks led further and further away from the safety of the groomed trails, winding through dense trees and over small ridges. As I moved deeper into the backcountry, an eerie silence settled around me. The kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. After about 15 minutes, I found myself standing at the edge of a steep slope, looking down into a narrow valley. The tracks continued down, heading straight towards a notorious avalanche zone. It was an area no one in their right mind would enter, especially not alone and on foot. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees, but there was no one. Just the wind whispering through the branches and the faint creak of snow shifting under its own weight. My heart started to pound as I stared at the footprints. They looked fresh, but how could that be? I pulled out my radio and called it in, my voice coming out shakier than I would have liked. "Dispatch, this is Jake. I'm at the boundary of the West Ridge off-piste area. I found a set of footprints leading into the avalanche zone. No sign of the person. Over." There was a crackle of static before a voice responded. "Copy that, Jake. Are you sure? It's a restricted area. Nobody should be out there." "Yeah, I'm sure. The tracks are fresh, and they lead right down into the valley." There was a long pause before the dispatcher spoke again. "Okay, Jake. We're sending a search team to your location. Don't go any further. It's too dangerous." "Understood." I replied, my eyes still glued to the tracks disappearing into the distance. I stood there, waiting, my mind racing with possibilities. Who would be crazy enough to venture into an avalanche zone? And why? My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, distant rumble. I looked up, eyes widening as I saw a massive cloud of snow begin to roll down the mountainside on the other side of the valley. Avalanche. I shouted into the radio, my voice breaking. There's an avalanche coming down the north face. I watched, helpless, as the wall of snow rode down the slope, swallowing everything in its path. It was a terrifying sight, and I could feel the ground trembling beneath my feet as the avalanche surged forward. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. A deafening silence followed, and the valley was buried under a thick blanket of snow. I waited, breathless, until the search team arrived. We combed the area as best we could, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. The footprints had vanished under the avalanche's weight, leaving nothing but a smooth, undisturbed surface. The team leader, a seasoned veteran named Greg, shook his head grimly as we stood at the edge of the devastation. There's no way anyone could have survived that. If there was someone out here, they're gone now. I nodded, swallowing hard. It didn't make sense. The footprints had been so fresh. How could someone just vanish like that? The incident was reported, and for a while, it became a bit of a local legend. People whispered about the ghostly tracks that led into the avalanche zone, about how no one was ever found. But as the season went on, the story faded, replaced by new tales and the usual gossip that circulates in ski towns. I tried to put it behind me, but something about those tracks haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, that whoever or whatever made those footprints was still out there. A few weeks later, I found myself back in the same area, alone again. I hadn't planned to go back, but something drew me there, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The snow had melted and refrozen several times since the avalanche, and the landscape looked different, almost unfamiliar. I skied down cautiously, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the footprints. I reached the spot where I had last seen them, my breath catching in my throat as I realized something. There, faint but unmistakable, were the tracks. They were right where they had been before, leading away from the trees and down into the valley. But this time, they were different. They were deeper, more pronounced, like whoever made them was struggling. My heart pounded as I followed them, the cold air biting at my cheeks. The tracks led me further down, past the spot where the avalanche had buried everything. I should have turned back, but I couldn't. I had to know. The footprints continued, winding through the valley and up a small hill on the other side. As I reached the top, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a small cabin. It was old and weathered, half buried in snow, with a sagging roof and boarded-up windows. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, yet the footprints led straight to the door. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn around and leave, but something compelled me to move forward. I approached the cabin slowly, my skis sinking into the deep snow. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was stale and cold, and a musty smell filled my nose. I looked around, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The cabin was empty, just a single room with an old, dusty bed and a broken chair. But then I noticed something strange. In the middle of the floor, there were more footprints. They circled around the room, leading to a small trapdoor in the corner. My heart raced as I walked over, my legs feeling like lead. I knelt down and reached for the handle, my breath catching in my throat. With a creak, the trapdoor opened, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. A wave of fear washed over me, but I couldn't stop now. I had to know what was down there. I took a deep breath and descended, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The staircase seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the mountain. I lost track of time, my mind consumed by the darkness pressing in around me. Finally, I reached the bottom and found myself standing in a narrow tunnel. The walls were rough and damp, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. I moved forward, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning like a labyrinth. And then I saw it. At the end of the tile, there was a small, dimly lit chamber. In the center of the room stood a figure, its back turned to me. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and translucent like ice. My heart pounded as I watched it, unable to move or speak. The figure turned slowly, and I felt a scream rise in my throat as I saw its face. It was a twisted, distorted version of my own, its eyes hollow and empty, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The figure stepped towards me, its movements slow and deliberate. I turned and ran, the tunnel closing in around me as I fled. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps echoing in the darkness, getting closer and closer. I reached the stairs and scrambled up, my hands slipping on the cold, damp wood. I burst through the trapdoor and slammed it shut, my chest heaving as I leaned against it, gasping for breath. I glanced around, my eyes wild. The cabin was empty, just as I had left it. But something was different. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. I knew I had to get out of there. I stumbled out of the cabin and into the snow, my legs shaking. I didn't look back as I skied away, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the lodge, collapsing in the snow outside. I don't know what I saw that day, or what happened in that cabin. All I know is that I was never the same after that. I tried to forget, to move on, but the memory haunted me, lurking in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't escape. I quit my job as a ski instructor and left the mountains, but the fear followed me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that twisted face, those hollow eyes staring back at me. I could still hear the footsteps, echoing in the darkness. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering about those footprints. Who made them? Where did they lead? And what was that thing in the cabin? I guess I'll never know. But one thing is certain. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting, watching. And I pray I never see it again. I never thought a simple shopping trip could turn into a nightmare. My life was as mundane as it gets. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. I didn't have much to worry about. But then, everything changed with that one item. It started on a lazy Sunday afternoon. I needed some groceries, and the local supermarket was my go-to place. It was always crowded, but I didn't mind. It gave me a chance to blend in, to be just another face in the crowd. That day, I had a short list: bread, milk, eggs, and some snacks. Simple enough. As I walked down the aisles, I noticed something odd in my cart. There was an old, dusty book sitting on top of my groceries. It was small, with a tattered leather cover and no title. I don't remember picking it up, and it didn't look like something I'd be interested in. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe someone had left it there by mistake. I put the book back on a random shelf and continued shopping. I didn't think much of it until I reached the checkout. There it was again, sitting on top of my items. I laughed nervously and shoved it to the cashier. "I don't know how this got in my cart," I said, handing it to her. She gave me a weird look, but took the book and placed it under the counter. I paid for my groceries, and that was that. Or so I thought. When I got home and started unpacking, my heart skipped a beat. The book was there, sitting on my kitchen counter as if it had been waiting for me. I backed away, my hands trembling. There was no logical explanation for this. I hadn't bought it, and I was sure I left it at the store. I didn't know what to do, so I did what anyone would in my situation. I threw it in the trash and tried to forget about it, but that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the book, its cracked cover and yellowed pages haunting my thoughts. I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. The next day, I went back to the store. I needed to clear my head, and running errands seemed like a good distraction. I was browsing the cereal aisle when I felt a familiar chill down my spine. I looked down, and there it was again, the book, lying in my cart. I felt my heart race. This was impossible. I had thrown it away, hadn't I? I picked it up, my fingers trembling, and flipped through the pages. They were blank, completely blank. My pulse pounded in my ears as I shoved it onto a shelf and walked away quickly. I couldn't focus for the rest of my shopping trip. My eyes kept darting around, looking for any sign of the book, but it was gone. I paid for my groceries and practically ran out of the store. I was halfway home when I glanced in the rearview mirror. My blood ran cold. The book was sitting on the backseat, propped up like it was a passenger. I slammed on the brakes and swerved to the side of the road. My hands were shaking as I opened the car door and grabbed the book. I hurled it into the bushes, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't normal. Something was very, very wrong. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. That night, I locked all my doors and windows. I even double-checked them. I was paranoid, but who could blame me? I crawled into bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow seemed like it was creeping closer. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint rustling noise coming from the living room. My heart pounded as I crept out of bed, clutching a flashlight like a weapon. I tiptoed down the hall, the beam of light shaking in my hand. When I reached the living room, I froze. There on the coffee table was the book. It was open, the pages fluttering as if a breeze was blowing through the room. But there was no wind, no open windows. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified, but I had to know what was happening. I walked over to the book and looked at the pages. Words had appeared, written in a neat, old-fashioned script. "You cannot escape." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This had to be a prank, some kind of sick joke. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel something watching me, something that wasn't human. I grabbed the book and ran to the backyard. I dug a hole, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the shovel. I threw the book in and covered it with dirt, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The next day, it was back in my house, sitting on the kitchen table like it belonged there. The words had changed. "Why are you running?" I felt like I was losing my mind. I tried everything, burning it, tearing it to shreds, even throwing it in the river. But no matter what I did, it always came back, and each time, the messages grew more sinister. "Come closer. Let me in. You cannot hide." It was relentless, and I was trapped. I stopped going to the store. I stopped leaving the house. I barely ate or slept. My life became a waking nightmare, consumed by the book and its terrifying messages. I knew it was wearing me down, breaking me bit by bit. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. I sat in front of the book, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The pages turned on their own, flipping wildly before stopping on a blank page. Slowly, words began to form. "You." I felt a cold dread wash over me. I was in over my head, dealing with something far beyond my understanding. But I couldn't back down now. I had to know. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The book seemed to shiver, the pages rippling as the words appeared. "You brought me here. You opened the door." I racked my brain, trying to remember. Had I done something to invite this? I couldn't think of anything, but the book wouldn't lie. It was feeding on my fear, growing stronger every day. "Please just leave me alone," I begged. But the book didn't answer. Instead, it flipped to the last page, the paper crackling ominously. One final message appeared. "Your story ends tonight." I felt a surge of terror so strong it nearly knocked me off my feet. I grabbed the book and ran outside, not caring where I was going. I just needed to get away. I ran through the dark streets, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town, the old abandoned quarry looming before me. I hurled the book into the darkness, my scream echoing in the silence. I stood there, my chest heaving, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing. Just silence and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I thought it was over. I thought I was free. I turned to leave, and that's when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder, cold and clammy. I froze, too terrified to move. Slowly, I turned around. There was no one there, just the empty darkness and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. But I could feel it, something watching me, something waiting. I backed away, my eyes darting around. And then I saw it. The book was lying on the ground, its cover open wide like a gaping mouth. The pages were filled with my words, my desperate pleas and terrified whispers. It was my story, written in blood-red ink. I realized then that I could never escape. It wasn't just the book that was cursed. It was me. I had become a part of it, my life bound to its pages. I ran, stumbling blindly through the darkness. But no matter how far I went, I could still feel it, following me, haunting me, pulling me back. I could see the words forming in my mind, the final chapter of my life being written. And then, just like that, I was back at my house, standing in front of the door. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle, but I couldn't stop myself. I opened the door and stepped inside, the book lying open on the floor, waiting for me. I picked it up, my heart heavy with dread. There was one last message scrawled across the page. Welcome home. The door slammed shut behind me, and I knew I was trapped. I was never going to leave. This was my life now, my story, my nightmare. The book was my prison, and I was its prisoner. And as I felt the darkness closing in around me, I realized the terrible truth. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some stories never end,